Sansa Stark knew the architecture of the Red Keep in a way few others did, though her lessons had never been part of a formal education. She remembered her first arrival vividly, the gilded carriage and her father's stern gaze under the brilliant sun. She had been little more than a girl daydreaming of gold-armored knights, handsome princes, and warm affections. But each corridor of the keep soon taught her lessons that bore sharp edges. Each smile, each courtesy, each traitorous whisper had hardened her heart. And beneath the layers of politeness embroidered upon her by Septa Mordain and her mother's gentle instructions, something quietly awakened. A sensibility to deception, an understanding that words often served as a more dangerous currency than steel. The halls of King's Landing were rife with secrets, and in time Sansa learned the skill of hearing all that was left unsaid. It was a subtle gift, honed in the presence of enemies, liars, and false flatterers. And inevitably, that gift turned her, slowly and painfully, from an innocent child into a careful player. She recalled the first time she had seen Lord Petyr Baelish truly work his magic, an evening banquet following her father's appointment as Hand. The conversation at the table had been lively enough, but beneath the laughter was the sense of a faint shift in alliances, as though Baelish were guiding the talk with invisible strings. Her father wore a grim expression, so ill at ease with the game that the undercurrents almost carried him away. At that time, Sansa paid it no mind, enchanted instead by the stories and decorations. Baelish was merely one more lord with soft words and cunning eyes, barely more interesting to her young mind than the elaborate lemon cakes served after the roast. Still, the old memory began to shape itself anew once Sansa recognized the nature of his manipulations. She remembered how he subtly guided the conversation away from her father's policies to matters of lesser significance. Old jokes about gold cloaks, witty remarks about royal finances. It was a deft redirection, orchestrated so that the seat of power at the table subtly shifted from the hand of the king to the master of coin. The memory, in the present, brought a half-smile to her lips and a pang of regret. If only she had realized it all sooner. Yet that was how things always were in King's Landing. Knowledge came too late. A fleeting hint here, a whispered rumor there. People vanished or had accidents or were shoved into cells. Sansa learned that illusions often mattered more than reality, and that survival depended on reading those illusions as adeptly as a maester read his tomes. When she stood as Joffrey's betrothed, standing with as much dignity as she could muster at court sessions, she watched Baelish's eyes rove the crowd. Petyr Baelish, with his mocking smile and his head slightly bowed in feigned respect, was always at the periphery. He had a serpent's grace in the way he drifted from one conversation to another, leaving traces of sly insinuations behind. More than once, she saw the change in a courtier's expression after Baelish whispered in their ear. She recognized the weight of influence, though she couldn't name it for what it was at the time. She was still a frightened girl then, hopeful and deluded, longing to be loved by a king who turned out to be monstrous. But in those days, Baelish remained a fixture, always in the corner of her vision, always half-smiling as if amused by everything. Those months under the watchful gaze of the Lannisters taught Sansa how to sit perfectly straight, how to school her features into pleasantness no matter the insult Joffrey hurled her way. She learned that silence could sometimes be her shield and that tears held no value in the Red Keep. She learned to quietly observe the interplay of alliances. Pycelle trying to safeguard his position through flattery, Varys weaving quiet threats through honeyed words, Cersei standing resolute with the unwavering cunning of a queen determined to safeguard her children. And always, she saw Baelish, flicking his eyes at a supplicant, letting a coin roll between his slender fingers, offering a sly remark that made powerful men grin or bristle. The subtlety of his maneuvering became more obvious the moment she understood how fragile power truly was in the capital. And Sansa took those lessons into her soul. Each day was an exercise in performance. Her smiles were masks, her courtesy an ablation, her hair groomed to appear docile, her steps measured so as not to offend. The illusions she built around herself were, at first, survival instincts. In time, those illusions honed themselves into skills. She learned not to let her voice tremble, not to let the tears come until she was locked away in her chambers, alone. After her father's execution, she realized just how vulnerable she had become, and how precious was every snippet of knowledge. Without the courtesy of King's Landing, Sansa might not have lived beyond those early days. There were no illusions left about gallant knights rushing to her rescue. There was only the cold surety that her father's friends were not friends at all, that her betrothed was a sadist, and that her hope for a fairy tale life had been snapped like a straw. Through that horrifying education, Sansa recognized in Baelish a shadowy figure who might offer salvation, but who bore no illusions of loyalty. He played the game for himself. His words, so comforting at times, were daggers in disguise. Yet the more she watched him, the more she recognized that a certain portion of power lay in unpredictability. Littlefinger carefully crafted illusions of being only somewhat cunning, and more interested in coin than in crowns. But Sansa saw moments when his facade slipped, revealing the depths of his ambition. And every time she witnessed such a slip, she memorized it. When they told her she was no longer betrothed to Joffrey but to be wed to Tyrion, she locked her despair behind a forced smile. In that swirl of politics, she glimpsed how Baelish manipulated her eventual union with House Tyrell before it was exposed. She recognized the cunning behind his every move. Yet this was also when she began to suspect that Peter saw her as an asset. She carried the Stark name. She carried the blood of Ned Stark, a piece in his puzzle that he could shape to his advantage. And while that knowledge frightened her, it also opened a possibility. If she was a piece in the game, she might yet transform herself into a player. Months later, when the Purple Wedding ended in chaos, and Baelish secreted her away from King's Landing, she went in terror, half convinced she would be devoured by the wolves that roamed the world. But in Baelish's presence, she discovered a different kind of fear, one that coiled around her heart like a viper. He lied so effortlessly. He manipulated the lords of the Vale, the merchants, and her Aunt Lisa with a flick of his wrist. He demonstrated a viciousness masked by courtesy, snuffing out lives without a second thought. His hidden networks extended beyond what she'd imagined. Even so, Sansa's time at his side was not simply a flight from Lannister retribution. It became an education. Day after day, she observed how Baelish managed his retinue of informants, how he balanced loyalty and fear, how he read a man's desires and used them against him. She felt repulsion, but also a morbid fascination. Gradually, she began to see through the illusions, noting the ways people flocked to flattery, how secrets proved a currency more powerful than gold. And she noted, too, that Baelish believed he held her in a thrall of confusion and dependency. He saw her as a bud he could shape to his design, a daughter figure who would cling to him for protection until he decided the time was ripe to marry her off, or exploit her in some yet unimagined scheme. But the seeds planted by her time in King's Landing could not be uprooted so easily. She knew what it meant to keep secrets in her heart, to listen when no one realized she was listening, to hide her true sentiments behind a courteous expression. If one listened quietly enough, the walls echoed with truths unspoken. That was the greatest lesson from her captivity in the capital. The game was never about open declarations or grand speeches. It was about the tiny movements, the subtle hints, the positioning of events that made outcomes appear inevitable. Sansa began to see how she might navigate those swirling waters. In Baelish's eyes, she remained a naive girl. In her eyes, she now saw the steps that led to the vantage point he occupied. Her return to the north with Baelish in the background was the next stage of her transformation. The north was her home, but it was also a place battered by war, uncertain in its alliances, and full of proud lords reluctant to yield to any foreign banner. Baelish aimed to use her claims and her presence to manipulate the north. Sansa, however, had begun to discover her own strength. She dared to question him more often, though softly, with that same gentle courtesy, so as not to arouse his suspicions too soon. She leaned into the lessons learned in the Red Keep, reading the moods of lords, appealing to their pride, shaping narratives with gentle words that stirred hearts yearning for the stability of House Stark. She recognized the ways in which fear could be turned into loyalty, just as she had seen the Lannisters do, though she abhorred tyranny. Her approach was gentler, but the tactics were reminiscent of the cunning she had internalized. And bit by bit, she gleaned that Baelish's confidence in his absolute control might be an opening to outmaneuver him. So she watched him carefully in the Eyrie, in Moat Cailin, and in every hush of the northern winds. She memorized the pitch of his voice when he lied, the tightening at the corners of his lips. She studied every subtle shift, like the way he angled his body when he wanted to appear modest, or how he would drop his gaze just enough to let a lord think he was being humble. Meanwhile, Sansa found that her name carried immense weight. The battered North wanted hope, a scion of Winterfell to rally behind, and she sensed how Baelish sought to harness that desire for his own ends. But so too could she harness it. She realized something crucial. Littlefinger, for all his cunning, was not infallible. He was a brilliant manipulator but had a blind spot for the power of genuine loyalty and moral authority. And though Sansa had been forced to adopt deception, at her heart, she had a sincere empathy for the North, for her people, for the old ways. The combination of her courtesy, her calm composure, and the authenticity of her claim formed an intangible force that Littlefinger did not entirely understand. He was adept at secrets and illusions, but the intangible bond between a Stark and her people was not built upon cunning alone. It was built upon trust, heritage, and the memory of old honor that Ned Stark symbolized. And so, while Littlefinger whispered deals into the ears of ambitious lords, Sansa would sit by the fire, listening to their stories of hardship, letting them recount tales of glory past, carefully planting seeds of unity around the name of Stark. She did not overplay her hand. She did not challenge Baelish openly. She merely allowed a swelling tide of Northmen's loyalty to grow in her presence. She used courtesy, humility, and the gentle confidence gleaned from her father's memory to endear herself to them. Yet, in her private moments, doubt gnawed at her. She remembered the helplessness she'd felt as a pawn in King's Landing. How could she be certain she was no longer a pawn in Baelish's game? She remembered the cynicism of the capital, the unscrupulous betrayals that had cost her father his life. She worried that if she showed even the smallest sign of rebellion, Baelish would retaliate, possibly by betraying her to enemies she could scarcely imagine. So she cultivated an image of docility. She lowered her eyes when he spoke to her, nodded in agreement with his proposals, and let him spin his webs. In the shadows, she was weaving her own threads, albeit with more caution. Each day, she recalled how the powerful lords of King's Landing had destroyed themselves through arrogance or rash action. Baelish might have been the one orchestrating those collapses, but the fact remained that illusions had undone them all. Sansa resolved never to let illusions blind her as they had once done. Instead, she used illusions now as her armor, never revealing too much of her hand. Her time in King's Landing had taught her the subtlety of secrets. What is known is easily destroyed. What is hidden can blossom in darkness. That slow blossoming of her confidence gained an unlikely ally in the form of rumor. Rumors spread through the North that Sansa Stark had returned from captivity, that she had endured horrors in King's Landing, that she had learned the ways of the southern courts. Some whispered that she was a broken girl, a fearful shadow of a noble lady. Others insisted she had returned as a cunning vixen, taught by none other than the infamous Littlefinger himself. And in the swirl of rumors, Sansa found a peculiar freedom. Some lords, believing her a broken bird, felt protective toward her. Others, wary of her cunning, believed she was potentially as dangerous as her supposed mentor. She realized something essential. Rumors, like illusions, were tools. She did not attempt to squash them. The conflicting stories created a cloud of uncertainty around her, and that uncertainty was a shield of its own. No one knew exactly what to expect from Sansa Stark. Peter Baelish, ironically, had taught her the value of being underestimated. Her meeting with Lord Royce in the Vale was a defining moment. Lord Royce, a proud man with a strong sense of honor, had suspected Baelish's hand in Lysa Arryn's death. He had glowered at them both. Baelish, with his usual grace, had begun weaving a story of accidents and tragedies, dismissing any suggestion of wrongdoing. Sansa stood at his side as Elaine Stone, meek, quiet, supposedly an illegitimate daughter. Then, in a single moment, she chose to take a risk. She stepped forward, speaking with gentle earnestness, confirming Baelish's story but adding key details that only she could know. Details that turned Royce's suspicion into grudging acceptance. It was a lie, of course, or a carefully curated half-truth, but she wove it so gracefully that Lord Royce, confronted by her apparent sincerity, found no angle to attack. She saw in that moment how easily she could shape a narrative if she used both honesty and deception in just the right measure. Baelish watched her closely afterward, an intrigued glimmer in his eye, but though he praised her for her performance, she could sense his wariness. She had stepped beyond the role of the timid girl, and that wariness, she knew, was a sign that he realized she possessed more power than he had accounted for. But it was not until she reunited with what remained of her family, when she discovered that her brother Bran yet lived, when she heard of Arya's rumored survival, and when her half-brother Jon Snow found himself raised as king in the North, that Sansa truly felt the stir of a deeper calling. The North was hers, in a way that no southern lord could ever claim. She had endured the serpents of King's Landing, the betrayals, the humiliations. She had been wed against her will, terrorized by a boy king, threatened, beaten down. Yet through it all, she remained Sansa Stark. The magnitude of her experiences could either crush her or sharpen her into steel. And as she gazed upon the ragged banners of old houses that had once served her father, as she listened to men recount the era of House Stark's leadership, she decided she would not be crushed. This was the land that gave her father his honor. This was the land that recognized loyalty and tradition. And this, she realized, was the land Baelish hoped to control by using her as a figurehead. The notion that he would exploit her family's legacy to expand his own power made her blood stir with indignation. The Sansa who had once cowered at Joffrey's cruelty would have left it at that. But the Sansa who had persevered through King's Landing saw an opportunity. If Baelish believed the North was merely another piece on his board, he was mistaken. The North's loyalty was tied to House Stark, not to him, and Sansa was Stark by blood. The lessons from King's Landing told her that while alliances could be purchased by gold or intimidation, there was a deeper loyalty here that Peter could not truly claim. So she resolved to place him in a position where all his cunning could not protect him from the unwavering devotion the Northern Lords felt for her family. The crucial step was ensuring that she could rally enough support to stand without Baelish. She needed alliances, armed strength, and a network of informants. Her first test was the Battle of the Bastards. She had thrown herself upon Baelish's mercy then, begging for the Knights of the Vale to save her half-brother's army from certain defeat. In that single request, she revealed how precarious her position remained. She had needed him, and though the knights arrived in time to secure victory, she felt the weight of her debt to Peter. She recalled how he stood upon the battlefield afterward, wearing a self-satisfied smirk. He had saved them, yes, but only because it suited him to do so. For a time, the euphoria of victory overshadowed her concern. Then, in the hush of winter, she reflected on the cost. That was the moment she knew she would need to outgrow her dependency on him, and she would need to do so swiftly before he turned that dependency into absolute control. In the aftermath, Baelish tried to position himself near the seat of power. He looked at Sansa as though he saw in her a mirror of his own ambitions, someone who had been wronged by the world, who would do whatever it took to win. She let him believe that for a while, letting his illusions balloon. He whispered suggestions that she, not Jon, was the rightful leader of the North. He dangled possibilities of royal alliances, of forging an army that could seize the Iron Throne. She listened, never outright refusing, allowing him to believe she was half tempted by his vision. In truth, she was using the same strategy she had seen the Lannisters use on unsuspecting lords. Give them what they want to hear, let them assume you are aligned, and let them march blindly into your snare. But Sansa's snare was crafted not from treachery alone. It was also born of loyalty to her family. She wanted to secure the North for Jon Snow and for House Stark's revival, free from Baelish's clutches. To accomplish that, she needed the support of the Vale's nobility and the Northern Lords. She needed to ensure that when the time came, Baelish could not manipulate them to his advantage. She spent long nights meeting with lords who had lost kin in the wars, comforting them, offering sincerity and a promise of a stable future. She reminded them of the old respect once given to Ned Stark, and she carefully shaped an image of a strong, resilient Lady Stark who had endured the capital's intrigues and returned wiser for it. Through those interactions, she gathered her own small circle of confidants, men and women who saw in her a mixture of gentleness and steel. She orchestrated it all behind a veil of modesty, letting Baelish believe he still held the reins, while in fact she was forging her own chain of alliances. This was something she had learned in the Red Keep. Rarely did power revolve solely around the throne. Much of it lurked in the corridors, in the kitchens, in the whispered pledges of guards and stewards. She found individuals once loyal to her mother, to her father, to House Tully. She reached out to those who had grown to resent Baelish for his meddling. She listened carefully to every rumor, and though she lacked Varys's network of little birds, she had her own ways of gleaning truths from the humblest sources. A cook who despised Baelish for cutting rations might reveal more than a noble who sang Baelish's praises. But as the tensions rose, the White Walkers loomed, and the realm teetered on the brink of an undead invasion. Sansa did not forget that a far greater threat might render all intrigues moot. Yet Baelish seemed more preoccupied with mortal crowns and the fracturing alliances of the Seven Kingdoms. It baffled Sansa at times that he could be so short-sighted in the face of an existential threat. But then again, King's Landing had taught her that many men refused to focus on the intangible until it was at their gates with claws and teeth. She resolved to prepare the North for both war and winter, as best she could, ensuring that the food stores were replenished and that the gates of Winterfell and surrounding towns were fortified. Where Baelish saw an opportunity to gather more power, she saw an opportunity to prove her leadership to the North. But she never confronted Baelish openly about his ambitions. Instead, she let him assume that he could lead her along, let him think that when the time came, she would do as he asked. In quiet moments, she recalled the times she had lulled Joffrey's temper by feigning obedience. If she could fool that monster, could she not also fool this cunning man? The perfect storm arrived in Winterfell's great hall one bitter day when Baelish tried to sow discord between her and Arya, newly returned from her own wanderings. He attempted to play them against each other using an old letter, forging tension over who might betray whom. The Sansa of King's Landing might have fallen for it. But that girl no longer existed. Instead, she saw how Baelish's scheme aimed to isolate her, to remind her that he was her only true ally, to weaken her bond with her siblings so that he could better control her. It was the most brazen move he'd made since returning to Winterfell. First, it chilled her. She feared that Arya might truly misunderstand her intentions, that all the old sisterly rivalries might bloom into real hatred. She confided in no one, but she turned her mind to how best to unravel Baelish's plan without tipping him off that she understood it. She whispered reassurances to Arya, letting her sister see that the time in King's Landing had changed her, that she was no longer the naive girl who once valued songs over truth. To unify them fully, Sansa recalled how she had once observed Baelish planting evidence in King's Landing that turned the blame for certain misdeeds onto the Master of Whispers. She recognized the pattern. He was forging proof of non-existent treachery to pit Stark against Stark. The greatest defense was a joint front. When the moment finally came, Baelish must have felt confident. He stood in the hall, flanked by guards loyal to him in the Vale, expecting Sansa to denounce her sister for what he presented as a threat to Sansa's authority. Instead, Sansa turned the accusations upon him with a composure that she had learned in the capital's courts, reciting the litany of his betrayals and manipulations, from the murder of Lisa Arryn to the role he played in her father's downfall. She uttered each charge in a level voice, reminiscent of how the Crown's judges once pronounced guilt at trials. She used the same calm authority that she had seen Cersei wield. This was her moment of retribution, a cunning checkmate. She watched the shock flicker across his features, the denial forming on his lips. In that instant, she felt a stirring of pity for the man who had once abducted her from King's Landing, half mentor, half tormentor. But the pity was overshadowed by resolve. She had grown wise enough to know that sparing Littlefinger's life would only invite him to weave more webs of deceit. The North demanded justice. His voice quavered as he tried to protest, and Sansa realized something else. For all his cunning, Petyr Baelish had never faced a reckoning from someone he had molded. He had never truly reckoned with the possibility that Sansa Stark might adapt his tactics and turn them upon him. She recalled how the Lannisters had underestimated Tyrion, how Joffrey had disregarded the consequences of cruelty, how so many had miscalculated at King's Landing, believing themselves invincible until it was too late. Now it was Baelish's turn, and Sansa delivered her verdict with that same unflinching composure, letting her sister execute the sentence that ended his life. There was no gloating in her gaze, no triumphant smile. It was a quiet, terrible finality. But in the silence that followed, she knew she had crossed a threshold. She had proven that the lessons learned in King's Landing were not for survival alone. They were for retribution, for claiming autonomy. In that moment, with Baelish's blood staining the cold stones, Sansa felt the burden and the power of being a Stark of Winterfell. In the aftermath, she knew that people would talk of how Petyr Baelish had lost to the very girl he once rescued. Some would say it was poetic justice. Others would whisper that Sansa Stark had become an even greater schemer than Baelish, that she had turned his own methods against him. But Sansa felt only a profound sense of relief and sorrow. She had not wanted to become this person who ordered a man's death in the great hall of her ancestors. Yet she could not regret it. He would never have stopped. He would have torn the North asunder if it served his ambition. She recognized that she had done what needed doing, as so many lords and ladies had done throughout history. The innocence in her was gone, but she had gained something else. A firm understanding that survival in this world required not only cunning but a willingness to act decisively when the time came. In the days that followed, the Northern lords looked upon her with renewed respect, and perhaps a little fear. They saw a woman who had navigated the pit of vipers in King's Landing and emerged strong enough to slay the greatest schemer of the realm. More importantly, they saw that she had done so in defense of her family and the North's stability. She was not a tyrant, nor was she a naive maiden. She had become Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell, an identity shaped by both the honor of her lineage and the harsh lessons of the South. In private, she would sometimes retreat to the Godswood, thinking of her father, recalling how gentleness and honor had once been all she knew. She did not regret the person she had become, for regret would not help the living. Regret would not shield her people from the terrors of winter. All she could do was move forward, applying the lessons that had been carved into her very soul in the Red Keep's labyrinth of cruelty. And so, as the threat of the Night King marched ever closer, she bent her mind to forging alliances. The Southern lords might not heed the Stark call unless they saw strength. Sansa wrote letters with the cunning approach she had observed in King's Landing, addressing vanity, pride, or fear in each letter's recipient, offering them incentives to stand with the North. Some she lured with promises of trade advantages once the storms abated. Others she flattered, appealing to their sense of chivalry. She gleaned from Baelish's old documents the names of lesser lords who might be swayed by coin. She subtly deployed them, ensuring that they would spread the word of an impending doom but also of a united front. The memory of how quickly King's Landing had turned on her father stayed with her. She would not be so bold as to trust in a single approach. The Red Keep had taught her that to survive, one needed multiple strategies unfolding simultaneously. And so she offered each region a different kind of approach, customizing her pleas in the manner that would best resonate. If Petyr Baelish had used secrets and blackmail, Sansa would use compassion and a measured threat of reality. The dead were marching, and only through unity could any kingdom hope to endure. That winter was long and cruel. Snowdrifts piled high against the walls of Winterfell. But within those walls, Sansa reorganized the staff, ensuring that food was rationed wisely. She made sure her people saw her in the kitchens, overseeing the preparations for the winter stores, offering words of encouragement to the servants. She learned each guard's name, each stable boy's fear, forging a sense of shared purpose that felt far removed from the gilded banquets of the Red Keep. Even so, She recognized that many of her strategies harkened back to King's Landing. A leader had to show presence, to appear in control, to manage perceptions. In King's Landing, illusions reigned supreme. In Winterfell, illusions were tempered by the reality of cold and hunger. Yet illusions still mattered. If the people believed their lady was strong, they would remain calm. If they sensed her fear, panic might spread. So she practiced the same composure she had once displayed before Joffrey. She kept her spine straight and her voice steady, even when dread gnawed at her insides. From time to time, she remembered the question that used to haunt her in the capital. How does one keep faith and honor in a world so full of treachery? She found her answer in the North's resilience and in her renewed bond with her siblings. Jon was a source of hope and determination, Arya of fierceness, Bran of mysterious wisdom. Together, they formed the foundation of House Stark's revival. Sansa believed that was the key difference between her and Baelish. He had wanted to stand alone, above the rest, while she understood that true strength came from unity. Perhaps the greatest lesson she had learned from him was what not to do, never to isolate herself so entirely that she forgot the bonds of loyalty and family. When the war against the dead finally came, Winterfell stood as the last bastion of hope for so many. Sansa took shelter in the crypts with those who could not fight, praying that the walls would hold, that her brother's forces could withstand the tide of whites. The sound of battle above felt like the thunder of gods warring across the heavens. Terror slid into her heart in icy tendrils, bringing memories of Joffrey's crossbow aimed at her, of her father's head upon the spike. But she pushed the memories aside. There was no place for that frightened girl here. She offered solace to the young ones huddled in corners, reminded them softly of the old gods, told them stories of heroes. She managed a serene face, though her heart thundered. And in that moment, the courtesy she had learned in King's Landing, the pretense of calm, proved invaluable. She realized that illusions could be used for good, to inspire courage, to keep people from collapsing under despair. She saw in the anxious faces around her the same hope she had once clung to in the Red Keep's darkest days, the faint belief that tomorrow could be better if only one held on. The dawn after the battle revealed the heavy cost, but also the resilience of the living. In the courtyard, corpses of whites lay scattered like broken dolls. The walls were scorched in places, battered in others. Winterfell stood battered but unbowed. Sansa emerged into the pale light, her cloak brushing ashes and snow, her expression somber yet proud. The living had prevailed just barely. She felt tears on her cheeks for the fallen. Friends, guards, even strangers who had come to defend Winterfell. But she also felt a sense of vindication. The illusions of King's Landing could crumble in the face of such a threat. The only illusions that mattered now were the ones that rallied people to stand together. And stand they had. Days turned to weeks as the realm slowly grasped what had happened in the north. Ravens flew across the land with news of the Great War. With the dead driven back or destroyed, attention returned to the question of who would rule the Seven Kingdoms. Remnants of the Lannisters clung to parts of the south, and new claimants emerged as they always did in times of chaos. Once again, the Game of Thrones resumed. Yet for Sansa, the game had changed irrevocably. She had seen the horror that nearly claimed them all. She had learned from King's Landing that the seat of power was never stable, that alliances shifted like sand. She had recognized that only by forging something deeper than fear, deeper than gold, could one build a lasting realm. So when envoys came from the south, bearing propositions and alliances, Sansa met them in the Great Hall, seated in the ancient wooden chair that once belonged to her forefathers. She projected the poise of a lady tempered by winter and war, her back straight, her voice measured. She listened to each envoy's terms and flattery, and in each polished phrase, she recognized echoes of old manipulations, the same manner in which Baelish might have tried to curry favor. Where once she might have been cowed by flowery compliments or thinly veiled threats, now she saw through them. She played the game with a subtlety that made the envoys uneasy. When she spoke, she gave polite, deflecting answers. She withheld her final decisions, stating that she would consult with her brother and the other lords of the north. She let them believe she might align, but never gave them reason to think she was fully convinced. She kept them guessing, always, and in private, she weighed each proposal not only for what it offered Winterfell but for what it might demand in return. She had learned from King's Landing that a bargain always demanded payment in one form or another. Over time, her courtiers whispered of Sansa's uncanny ability to sense deceit. They told tales of how she once survived King's Landing and, through those trials, gained the discerning eyes of a hawk. They said no one could lie to her without her knowing. In truth, she was no sorceress. She simply recognized the small signs, hesitations, forced smiles, contradictions. She was not infallible, but her keen observations often gave her an edge. And though some feared her for it, many others respected her. She did not wield her knowledge like a blunt hammer. She used it sparingly, unveiling truth at just the right moment to keep would-be manipulators off balance. It was as though Baelish's ghost lingered, reminding her of the power of timing, the advantage in surprise. She never forgot the final look on his face when she revealed she had known all along. Surprise, betrayal, fear. She had taken those emotions he had inflicted upon so many and turned them upon him. Even now, she felt the memory as a cautionary tale of what the game could do to those who believed themselves untouchable. Occasionally, she walked the ramparts at night, gazing at the snow-draped courtyard below, the flickering torches painting golden pools of light on the walls. She would recall walking those same ramparts as a child, waiting for her father to return from a hunt, dreaming of nights and southern tournaments. Now the courtyard was filled with the aftermath of real war, and she herself had become a figure of both admiration and wariness. She reflected on whether any of this could have happened without her suffering in King's Landing. The question tasted bitter. Without that suffering, she might have remained a sweet, naive girl, unprepared to shoulder the burdens that now weighed upon her. Yet she could not entirely hate the lessons, for they had sharpened her mind and given her the tools to outmaneuver one of the deadliest players in the realm. In time, the question reached her ears. Did Sansa Stark truly surpass Littlefinger in cunning? People debated it around hearths, in secret gatherings, in half-whispered corridors. Some said she was guided by advisors more experienced than she let on. Others argued that she had bested him single-handedly. Sansa never joined these discussions. She let the rumor swirl, let it feed her legend. The more people believed she was capable of out-scheming the Master of Coin, the less likely they were to try their own manipulations. Again, illusions served her. She had learned from the best how to wield them, and yet, at her core, she was still guided by a sense of justice. The cunning she employed was not for personal gain alone. It was for the safety and prosperity of the North, for the security of her loved ones. As the realm slowly recovered from the devastation of war, she quietly encouraged trade routes through White Harbor, forging beneficial agreements with lords who had proven their loyalty during the fight against the dead. She wrote letters to lords in the Riverlands, seeking to renew old alliances from her Tully heritage. She expanded Winterfell's contact with the Iron Islands, acknowledging that if the realm was to be stable, it needed every corner to be heard. Each measure was carefully balanced, offering just enough advantage to those she courted without leaving the North vulnerable. It was a delicate dance, one that might have left her dizzy had she not practiced a simpler version in the Red Keep. But the difference was stark. In King's Landing, she had only been an observer and occasional victim of the game. Here in Winterfell, she was the one orchestrating the moves. Sometimes, she wondered if she risked becoming the very thing she once hated. After all, cunning and manipulation were not the marks of straightforward northern honor. Yet she reminded herself that this was no time for blind idealism. The game was real, and if she abandoned cunning, she would leave the North exposed. Ned Stark's pure honor had been his downfall in a realm of serpents. She grieved that truth, but she had learned from it. A part of her still cherished the notion of a realm ruled by genuine fairness. But until that day came, she would use every tool at her disposal to protect her people. And if that meant employing illusions, half-truths, and strategic alliances, so be it. The further passing of months brought new uncertainties. Word reached Winterfell that various southern houses had begun contending for the Iron Throne once more. Some called for a grand council to determine the realm's future. Others whispered of foreign alliances, of new Targaryen claims. Sansa sat in her solar, reading each raven-sent message meticulously. She recognized the potential pitfalls. If she allowed the North to be drawn into southern politics unprepared, they could be entangled in another devastating war. But if she isolated them entirely, she risked future aggression from southern kings who might see the North as a rebellious territory. Again, she fell back on the lessons from King's Landing. Strike a balance, appear open to negotiations while keeping her true aims close to her chest. She corresponded with each faction politely, emphasizing the devastation the North had suffered in the Great War, reminding them that the North was rebuilding. She neither promised loyalty nor declared independence outright. She maintained a delicate stance, waiting to see how the pieces would fall. In those days, she found herself thinking of Baelish's approach to chaos. He had once told her that chaos was a ladder. For him, chaos was an opportunity to climb. But Sansa had also seen how chaos devoured the innocent. She preferred to shape order from chaos if she could. So she guided conversations with southern lords, trying to foster a sense that stability and unity were better than further bloodshed. She appealed to their sense of self-preservation. One more war could plunge the realm back into ruin. At the same time, she did not let them think North was weak. She hinted at alliances with the Vale, referencing that the knights still owed House Stark a great debt from the earlier victories. She spoke of northern resilience with quiet confidence. She let them draw their own conclusions that attacking the North would be foolish. In essence, she used fear and hope in tandem, the same way she had seen the Lannisters do. But she wielded it with a gentler hand, forging a path that might lead to fewer coffins. As the snows finally began to recede and the first green buds appeared in the Godswood, Sansa walked among the weirwoods, thinking of the question that had echoed in her mind for years. Had her time in King's Landing taught her enough to surpass Littlefinger's schemes? The answer seemed clear enough in the freshly thawed air. She had not simply surpassed him. She had undone him. She had used his own methods to unseat him. But more than that, she had learned that cunning alone was not enough to rule. Leadership demanded empathy, a sense of duty, and a willingness to act decisively for the greater good. Baelish had lacked empathy. Cersei had lacked mercy. Tywin Lannister had lacked humility. Each of them, in their own way, had taught Sansa what not to do. And so, she had assembled a more complete vision of power, one that balanced the illusions of courtly cunning with the sincere bonds of loyalty. In that, she believed, lay her greatest victory over Peter Baelish. He could not understand a realm guided by genuine trust and respect, whereas she both understood it and valued it. Occasional nightmares still haunted her. Joffrey's laughter, Cersei's cold glares, her father's agonized final moments. Yet they propelled her to strengthen her domain. She pored over the ledgers, the supply reports, ensuring that when next winter arrived, the North would be better equipped. She reached out to vassal lords, bridging old feuds that had been exacerbated by war. In each interaction, she employed the courtesy and self-control that had once saved her life at the Red Keep. She knew the cost of failure in the Game of Thrones. She had seen heads roll and blood spilled. Even if the threat of the undead was gone, humans were perfectly capable of monstrosities all their own. She would not allow her people to suffer again if she could help it. As she navigated each new challenge, Sansa recognized a profound truth. King's Landing might have been a viper's nest, but it was also the crucible in which she had been tempered. Without it, she might never have learned to preserve her soul in the face of darkness or to wield courtesy as both a shield and a blade. There came a day when ambassadors from Dorne arrived, draped in bright silks despite the lingering chill, speaking of renewing alliances. They were courteous, though frank about their own ambitions. Sansa welcomed them in the Great Hall, offering the hospitality of Winterfell. She listened carefully to their proposals, each one brimming with references to trade routes and mutual defense pacts. She smiled and nodded, dissecting their words for hidden meanings, recalling how in King's Landing she had seen lesser lords speak in half-truths. She recognized the nuance. Dorne wanted security and perhaps a chance to influence the North. Instead of giving immediate answers, she asked them pointed questions about their willingness to aid in rebuilding the villages devastated by winter. She pressed them politely about their stance on a possible Southern king. She made no commitments, but she planted ideas, letting them carry home the impression that the North and Dorne could find common cause, provided it was on terms that acknowledged the North's sovereignty and the rebuilding efforts. By day's end, they left Winterfell without an ironclad treaty, but with the sense that Lady Sansa Stark was neither a naive puppet nor a tyrant. She was something else, a calm, measured ruler, capable of outmaneuvering any who believed her nothing more than a lady from a cold land. Weeks later, as the seasons shifted, she met with her siblings in the Solar. Jon, newly returned from a diplomatic mission, spoke of uncertain times in the south, factions contending over the Iron Throne, alliances forming and dissolving like ice in spring. Arya, ever restless, spoke of journeys she wished to undertake, to see the world with her own eyes. Bran, distant yet insightful, shared cryptic observations about how each choice shaped the future in ways unseen. Sansa listened, absorbing their perspectives. Then she shared her own stance. The North should stand firm, open to alliances but not beholden to any southern contender. She explained that if the realm fell back into civil war, it was not the North's duty to prop up a false king. Better to remain vigilant, united, and capable of defending themselves. Jon, who had once sought to unify the realm in the face of the undead, nodded wearily, seeing the necessity. Arya shrugged, content so long as she remained free. Bran gave her a knowing look, as though he glimpsed the tapestry of time in which Sansa's approach was crucial. Outside the window, the last of the snow drifts glistened under a wan sun. The realm was changing, yet the cycle of power continued. Sansa recalled how she once stood at King's Landing's docks, gazing at the ships, wishing she could sail away from her nightmare. Now she was in a seat of power herself, shaping the destiny of the North. She felt both a quiet pride and a deep humility. She understood how easily power could be lost. She had seen it happen to her father, to Renly, to Stannis, to the Lannisters. She knew that if she became complacent, the game would devour her as it had so many. But she also knew she was not alone. She had her family, her people, and the lessons of the capital etched into her mind. In the private hours before dusk, she sometimes wondered if Peter Baelish's spirit might linger, whispering in corners, praising or mocking her maneuvers. She would push away the memory, reminding herself that she had laid him to rest as surely as one could. She remembered the final moment of his life, how she had stood tall and unflinching, delivering the justice that had eluded him all his life. That was the moment she realized she had inherited not only Ned Stark's sense of duty, but also Catelyn Stark's fierce resolve to protect her children. She had become a formidable woman forged by cruelty yet anchored by love. No matter how cunning Baelish had been, love was a dimension of power he had never truly grasped. He used illusions and currency, while she harnessed loyalty, family, and a region that cherished its legacy. Thus, she had surpassed him. It was not solely about cunning. It was about the heart that guided that cunning. As the quiet months slipped into a more temperate season, the realm stirred with new developments, fresh intrigues, and calls for a great council in the capital. Sansa attended to her duties, considering carefully whether the North should send a delegation. She spoke with Jon, who believed that making a presence known might keep the North from being sidelined in any crucial decisions. She consulted with Arya, who scoffed at the idea of returning to the South at all but admitted that ignoring it entirely could bring consequences. Sansa weighed their arguments and concluded that perhaps a small contingent could journey south to gather information. But this time, the North would not arrive as pawns. They would arrive as an independent power bloc, with no illusions about Southern courtesy. Sansa would ensure that they carried themselves as equals, not supplicants. The memory of her father's arrival in King's Landing long ago still burned within her. She would not let history repeat its tragedy. Before the Northern Party departed, Sansa personally oversaw their preparations. She made sure they were well supplied, accompanied by a retinue of sharp-eyed soldiers and cunning advisors. She wrote letters introducing them, forging polite relations but making no promises. She told them to be wary, to trust no one's flattery, to remember that the Red Keep was a labyrinth of lies. A pang went through her as she recalled her younger self, so entranced by the beauty of the palace, so unaware of the jaws waiting to snap. She prayed that her experiences would guide them, that they might avoid the pitfalls that had once ensnared her. When they left Winterfell, the courtyard felt a little emptier. But Sansa took solace in the knowledge that she had prepared them better than she had ever been. She walked the battlements, letting the northern wind whip at her hair, her cloak rustling around her ankles. In that crisp air, she felt alive and strangely at peace. She gazed at the horizon where the sky met the snow-dappled land, thinking of how far she had come from that girl who had once dreamed only of a handsome prince and a perfect courtly life. She had found none of those illusions, but she had found a deeper truth. The strength of a Stark was not in naive hope but in tempered resolve, in adaptation, and in a heart that refused to yield to despair. And as dusk settled, she retreated to her solar, penning careful letters to lords and ladies who might shape the future of Westeros. She wrote with the practiced hand of a diplomat, weaving courtesy with caution, forging potential alliances without binding herself to promises she could not keep. She recalled how Cersei had often dominated through fear. She recalled how Marjorie Tyrell had tried to charm her enemies into submission. She recalled how Baelish had twisted truths for personal gain. She sought a middle path, offering respect and mutual benefit, but also reminding recipients that House Stark was not to be slighted. Each letter bore her seal, the direwolf sigil pressed into dark wax. That seal, once the symbol of a fallen house, now carried renewed weight, in no small part thanks to her ability to navigate the darkest corridors of King's Landing. In the flicker of candlelight, as she set the quill aside, she murmured a soft thanks to the old gods for having watched over her. She remembered a day years ago when she had prayed in the Red Keep's gods would. A pitiful affair, a southern gods would lacking the true northern spirit, begging for deliverance from Joffrey's torment. She thought of how that deliverance had come in unexpected ways, through alliances and betrayals that had broken her illusions. Yet if she had remained the docile girl of those days, she would never have survived to sit here in Winterfell's solar, forging the future of the North. In a moment of reflection, she realized that surpassing Littlefinger's schemes was not simply about cunning. It was about learning from tragedy. Littlefinger had thrived on chaos, but Sansa had endured it and emerged with her compassion intact. She might not sing the same songs she once did as a child, but she still believed in a kinder world, one that could be built by those who had the courage to shape it. Perhaps that was what truly set her apart from Baelish. He had sought to climb the ladder for himself, while she sought to raise the North for the sake of everyone within it. Her time in King's Landing had given her the tools. Her own heart had given her the purpose. That night, sleep came softly. Her dreams drifted through halls of ice and stone, through memories of silent corridors in the Red Keep. She saw again the face of Meryn Trant, the sneer of Joffrey, the concerned eyes of Tyrion, the calculating glances of Cersei. In her dream, she walked among them in a crimson gown, unafraid, returning each gaze with one of her own, seeing their illusions melt away like snow in spring. She awoke with a soft gasp, the early light of morning filtering through her window. For a moment, she wondered if she was still in that southern palace, but then she felt the distinct cold of the north. She rose, wrapped in a fur-lined robe, and looked outside. Winterfell stood proud, steam rising from the hot springs near the walls, the courtyard already bustling with activity. This was her home, and for better or worse, she had become its protector, a role she was now well-equipped to fulfill. In the following days, small matters occupied her attention, disputes over pasture land, arguments among minor lords. With each case, she practiced the balance of fairness and firmness. She listened to the testimony of both sides, gleaning the truths behind their words, gently coaxing compromise. She recalled how King's Landing had turned even small disputes into grand spectacles, how lords would posture for advantage. Here, she kept it simple, ensuring that the final verdict felt just. But she did not hesitate to remind them of the Stark authority when needed. Her approach was neither naive nor tyrannical. She found that middle road again, where illusions served the truth rather than overshadowing it. Soon enough, new letters arrived from the southern delegations, referencing the presence of the northern envoys at King's Landing and their polite but firm demeanor. Sansa read these letters with an inward smile. She could almost hear Baelish's voice in her ear, admonishing her to press an advantage, to twist the situation in her favor. But she tempered that inclination with a sense of caution, mindful that the best move was often to see how the board rearranged itself. She penned her responses with careful phrasing, praising any show of goodwill, requesting more detailed proposals, playing for time. Let them think the North was interested but not desperate. Let them think they needed the North more than the North needed them. She felt a surge of pride that she could do this without becoming a villain, that she could protect her home while treating others with courtesy. That balance, so delicate, so essential, was the true art of ruling. Winter lost its iron grip, and the roads cleared for travel. Merchants began to flow north again, bringing goods and the latest gossip. Sansa heard how some Southerners claimed that Lady Stark was a frigid ice queen, so changed by her ordeals that she had no warmth left. She only smiled at such tales. They were illusions too, spun by people who had never shared her trials. If fear of her kept the wolves at bay, so be it. It was better than being dismissed as a naive child. She also heard rumors that some admired her as a woman who had navigated the labyrinth of the South and lived to build something stronger. At times, she heard her name linked with potential matches, from princes across the narrow sea to ambitious lords seeking to tie themselves to House Stark. She paid little mind to such rumors. She had been used as a marriage pawn once before, and she had no intention of letting that happen again. If a match were ever made, it would be on her terms. One evening, as she dined with her siblings, they reminisced about their childhood. Arya joked about the time Sansa had fawned over knights' tales, and Sansa smiled ruefully. She admitted that while she once yearned for a storybook existence, life had taught her different. Jon, a quiet presence, studied her with a somber gaze. He knew more than most the trials she had faced. Bran, ever cryptic, added that sometimes to protect the ones you love, you must become what you are not. Sansa wondered if that was what she had done. But she concluded that the woman she had become was still, at her core, Sansa Stark of Winterfell. She had not become someone else. She had simply grown. Across the following months, the North found a new equilibrium. Rebuilding efforts bore fruit, and the roads once again connected distant holds. Sansa managed trade negotiations, forging a prosperous web that improved the North's overall strength. Her cautious approach to southern entanglements meant that the North remained at peace while others squabbled. Time and again, she faced new challenges, bandits on remote roads, tensions between houses, but she addressed each with a blend of the courtesy she'd honed and the fortitude that was her birthright. And through it all, she remembered King's Landing, not with bitterness, but with a certain gratitude for the lessons it had imparted. Eventually, a raven arrived announcing a grand assembly in the capital to determine the succession of the Iron Throne. Jon believed they should attend in person, to ensure the North's voice was heard, though he had no desire for the throne himself. Sansa considered carefully. She had sworn never to be caged in that city again, yet a sense of responsibility tugged at her. She knew that if the North did not attend, decisions would be made without them. And the North was no longer a backwater region. It was a power in its own right. Sighing, she agreed that they would go, but only with adequate preparations. She wanted to show the realm that the North was not merely a participant. It was a key player. She spent weeks arranging the retinue, ensuring that every detail of their presentation would send a message. The North was united, dignified, and not to be trifled with. When at last they departed, Sansa rode at the head of the column with her siblings beside her. The roads stretched southward, weaving past mountains and rivers. Each league brought a ghost of memory. The bitter sting of the capital's intrigues, the face of Joffrey twisted in cruelty, the day Baelish spirited her away on a ship, She kept her composure, reminding herself she was no longer that frightened girl. She was Lady Stark, and each day on the journey, her retinue recognized the discipline she instilled. There would be no drunken squabbles, no loose talk. She guided them with a firm hand. It was as if she had integrated the best aspects of her father's honor with the cunning the South had forced upon her. On the final approach to King's Landing, they saw the city's walls glimmering in the distance. Sansa's heart thudded, remembering the betrayal she had once experienced within those walls. She inhaled deeply, meeting Jon's eyes. He gave her a nod of reassurance. She squared her shoulders, her expression calm. If the Southern lords expected the same naive maiden who had left years before, they would be sorely mistaken. If they expected a timid voice, they would hear a measured authority. If they sought to corner her with illusions, they would find themselves ensnared instead. She had come full circle. The Red Keep loomed ahead, but she was no victim returning to the scene of her torment. She was a player returning to the board with the power of Winterfell at her back. Within those towering gates, she would tread carefully, employing every bit of knowledge and skill gleaned from the hardest lessons of her life. No matter the outcome of the Southern Assembly, Sansa was resolved to protect the interests of her people. She would face the dais from which Joffrey once showed her cruelty, the courtyard where she had once trembled in fear. She would walk the same halls that had whispered her father's doom. But she would do it as a woman shaped by those experiences, not defined by them. She had gleaned enough from King's Landing to surpass even Littlefinger's schemes, for she had discovered a blend of courtesy, cunning, unity, and moral purpose that transcended his calculating self-interest. And so the horses clopped upon the wide stone roads leading into the city. The banners of the dire wolf fluttered in the southern breeze. People on the streets paused to watch, hushed, as the northern party entered. Sansa's gaze swept over them, noting their curiosity, their guarded respect. She wore a cloak trimmed with fur, a subtle reminder of her heritage and a symbol of the chill that had once tempered her spirit. Her eyes flickered to the Red Keep in the distance, its red walls tinted gold by the sun. Memories threatened to surge, but she held them at bay. She would not be shackled by the P.S.T. This time, she was coming with her head held high, prepared to negotiate or confront as necessary. The illusions of the capital might swirl, but she had learned their nature, and she possessed illusions of her own. In that measured step, in that slow ride toward the keep, Sansa Stark exemplified the balance she had attained. Her time in King's Landing had taught her the intricacies of power and the necessity of masks. But her northern blood reminded her of honor, family, and integrity. Together, those forces made her formidable, a woman who could guide the future of the North and stand among the southern powers without bowing to their manipulations. The sun climbed higher, illuminating her face. She set her jaw. If any man or woman in the capital thought to toy with Sansa Stark, they would find themselves staring into the icy clarity of a soul that had seen too much and yielded too little. Baelish's ghost might haunt these halls, but his living schemes were at an end, outmatched by the one he had most underestimated. And as the banners swayed, and the throng parted to let the northern retinue pass, Sansa moved forward, ready to face whatever new intrigues awaited, secure in the knowledge that she could outmaneuver them. For she had lived through King's Landing and carried its lessons like weapons hidden beneath her courteous smile, prepared to defend the North and those she loved from any threat that dared arise. Sansa Stark had passed beneath the Blackwater Gate once before as a child. That morning she first rode with her family into King's Landing, ignorant of the dangers coiled in every corner. Now, upon her return, she came not as a bright-eyed girl but as a woman who had walked through countless nightmares, forging cunning from suffering and steel from sorrow. Soldiers at the gate stepped aside at the sight of the Stark banners streaming overhead, the gray direwolf on a field of white, and also the presence of the imposing northern retinue that flanked her. Eyes followed her progress, some curious, some distrustful, but all aware they were witnessing a Stark, perhaps the Stark, who had outlived many southern royals. The sunlight of early spring cast a pallid glow on the city's slush-covered streets. Mounds of melting snow lined the gutters, a testament to the fact that winter's devastation had reached as far south as King's Landing. Evidence of past strife was everywhere. Burned ruins where shops once stood, half-reconstructed walls, vacant plots of land with rubble heaps. Though the city still bustled with noise, peddlers shouting wares, dogs yapping, blacksmith hammers ringing faintly, it felt subdued compared to the riotous throngs Sansa remembered. War, winter, and famine had taken their toll. She scanned the faces she passed. Wary children, hungry-eyed peasants, a few lean sellswords walking with a predatory swagger. Their attention slid to the northern column and then away. Sansa's cloak was trimmed with wolf fur at the collar, and her auburn hair, braided down one shoulder, swayed with every step of her mare. She did not flinch beneath the scrutiny. If anything, she felt a calm dignity settle over her. Jon rode close by, his gaze keen and protective. Arya had opted to ride near the front of the retinue, a hood pulled low over her features, scanning alleys as if expecting an ambush at any moment. Bran traveled in a closed litter, accompanied by a small guard of men sworn to House Stark, for he had not wished to be parted from them. Close to Sansa's side rode Lord Glover, the tall and imposing Wyman Manderly's nephew, and a handful of lesser northern knights who had pledged to safeguard her. They had insisted upon escorting her, reminding the realm that if the South wished to treat with House Stark, it must do so on equal footing. The last time Sansa had come to King's Landing, she'd been introduced to the Red Keep's labyrinth of courtyards as a prospective bride, a bright accessory in the hand of the king's retinue. The memory felt like a half-forgotten dream. Now she arrived with no illusions about the place. She guided her mare forward, leading the procession along the broad, steep streets that wound uphill toward the keep. The clack of hooves echoed off stone facades. A few curious onlookers lingered in doorways, but no one rushed forth with garlands or cheers. Whatever King's Landing had become, it was not the same city that once welcomed the royal caravans with elaborate fanfare. Time had changed its rulers, too. News had reached Winterfell of the Lannisters' decline after the wars, of a tenuous peace that hovered across the realm while various houses jockeyed for advantage. The calls for a great council had finally grown too loud to ignore. The capital had asked lords from the Seven Kingdoms to send representatives who would hammer out the future of the Iron Throne. Some rumored a Targaryen queen had once threatened the city with dragonfire. Others whispered that Cersei had died or was held under watch. The truth was uncertain, shrouded in rumor, and Sansa intended to learn all of it firsthand, mindful that any alliance she struck must protect the North above all else. Her company reached the shadow of the Red Keep, its high walls looming with memories that made her skin prickle. She remembered standing on those ramparts, a frightened girl forced to watch horrors unfold. But she had conquered those fears. She lifted her chin as she approached the gates. The gold cloaks posted there looked uncertain, scanning the group. Jon offered their credentials, the royal summons that had been sent to Winterfell. Arya tugged her hood lower, saying nothing, while Sansa's expression remained politely distant. After a tense pause, they were admitted to the outer courtyard. Inside, the Red Keep looked less immaculate than she recalled. Sections of the curtain walls had been hastily repaired. Scaffolding clung to the outer towers like a lattice of sticks. To her left, the training yard was mostly empty, muddy from half-melted snow. Still, the keep soared above them, its red stone tinted with gold in the late afternoon light. She recalled once how the architecture had dazzled her, how she marveled at the royal banners. But she had come to learn that beneath such grandeur lurked the darkest of intrigues. To her eyes now, the keep was neither splendid nor imposing. It was simply the seat of men and women who played a deadly game, and she had learned how to play. A steward appeared, cloaked in deep crimson, bowing stiffly. His eyes briefly flicked from Sansa to Jon, to the rest of their company. "Lady Sansa Stark, Lord Jon Snow," he murmured. "We have quarters prepared for you and your entourage. If you would follow me." Sansa inclined her head in acknowledgement. He spoke with an uncertain note in his voice. Perhaps the word had already spread. The Lady of Winterfell had come, not as a cowering girl, but as one who had bested Peter Baelish and orchestrated alliances that ensured the North's survival. Rumors painted her as an implacable presence, a rumor she would let stand. They dismounted in the courtyard, stable hands hurrying to tend the horses, though their numbers seemed fewer than before. Sansa glanced around, half expecting to see some old adversary lurking in the shadows. Instead, she saw new faces, men and women who were likely put into place after the wars. She caught glimpses of the fortress she remembered, but so many details had changed. Scaffolding, chipped paint, shattered mosaic. The siege and battles that had rocked King's Landing had left their scars. Part of her felt grim satisfaction in seeing the keep's veneer of perfection so thoroughly marred. She walked beside Jon as they followed the steward through the courtyard arches and into the main hall, guards trailing behind. The air inside smelled of stale rushes and old incense, a memory that tugged at her chest. Chandeliers above flickered with flames, and the corridor glowed with a mix of twilight and torchlight. Echoes of their footfalls followed them, sharp on the stone floors. Sansa kept her posture straight, her face calm, though her heart was stirring with recollections of heartbreak, dread, and terror. Yet she was not here to dwell on them. She was here to shape the North's future. At length, the steward led them to a suite of chambers overlooking the bay. 2 large doors of dark wood swung open, revealing an antechamber with a hearth. A table with chairs stood near the windows, while another door presumably led to sleeping quarters. The steward bowed again, explaining that more rooms adjoined this corridor for the rest of the Stark retinue. Sansa thanked him in a level voice and watched him leave. Once he had gone, the guards stationed themselves discreetly outside, leaving Sansa alone with Jon and Arya. Arya drew back her hood, loosing a short, frustrated breath. "I hate this place," she muttered. Her gray eyes flickered over the walls as if expecting to see ghosts creeping out of them. "Too many memories." Sansa nodded. "I know." Jon exhaled quietly. "We'll do what we must, and then we'll return home. This council might drag on, but the sooner we establish the North's position, the sooner we can leave." "Yes," Sansa said, though her gaze lingered on the cold hearth. "But we need to be vigilant. We have no idea who might be in the city with their own agendas." Jon agreed. His expression was set, lines of weariness at the corners of his eyes. "We've faced worse than southern lords with inflated egos. Still, be careful." "Always," Sansa said. That evening, servants arrived to stoke the hearth, bring fresh linens, and deliver a simple meal: fish stew, black bread, and honeyed wine. The city's supplies were evidently still recovering from the ravages of war and winter, as the meal was far simpler than the lavish feasts that once characterized King's Landing. Sansa didn't mind. Better an honest meal than a decadent one that concealed poisonous intrigue. She took her supper in the antechamber with Jon, discussing plans in low voices while Arya prowled the corridor, presumably to take stock of the keep's defenses. A sense of tension wove through the conversation. They had agreed to avoid being pulled into southern squabbles, but the Great Council was to convene in 2 days' time, and they must decide how best to represent the North's interests. Some said the realm might choose a new monarch by acclamation, while others insisted the remaining Lannisters would cling to power. Rumors also spoke of a Targaryen claimant, though Sansa found that uncertain. She resolved to gather as much information as possible, to read the players as she once read them from the shadows of the royal court. After supper, she allowed herself a moment of solitude. She stepped out onto the small balcony that overlooked Blackwater Bay. The air held a salty tang, and a stray breeze brushed strands of her hair across her cheek. The lights of the city below flickered like distant stars. She placed her hands on the stone balustrade and closed her eyes, letting the hush of the night soothe her. So many ghosts whispered here. Her father's last warnings, the distant memory of Joffrey's cruel laughter. But she refused to be haunted. She had returned, stronger than ever, and she would ensure the North did not suffer the same betrayal it once endured. Morning arrived with a thin haze over the water and the caw of gulls overhead. Sansa rose early, determined to refamiliarize herself with the Red Keep's passages. She dressed in a modest gown of gray wool trimmed in white, a direwolf pin clasping her cloak. The lines were clean and graceful, reminiscent of northern fashion. She chose no southern fripperies, no elaborate silks. Let them see she was of the north, and that the north was not here to beg favor. A pair of northern guards followed her as she moved through the corridors, observing the changes. Most tapestries that once depicted the Baratheon-Lannister alliance were gone or in tatters, replaced with generic scenes of hunting or feasting, likely to mask scorch marks and damage. The hush felt eerie. She passed a pair of gold cloaks who bowed stiffly, uncertain whether to greet her as Lady of Winterfell or simply as a guest. She gave them a polite nod. In the old days, she would have been stopped at every turn, informed that wandering was not permitted without an escort. But times had changed, and no single family claimed absolute rule here. The power vacuum was apparent in the uncertain posture of the soldiers, the harried courtiers flitting past with anxious expressions. Sansa recognized that King's Landing existed in a lull, waiting for the Great Council to decide the shape of the realm. That lull was dangerous. She knew from experience that chaos bred opportunists who would seize advantage quickly, as Baelish once had. Determined to forestall any threat that might corner the north again, she headed to the courtyard to meet whomever might cross her path. The courtyard brimmed with new arrivals. Envoys from Dorne in bright, flowing robes, Tyrell loyalists in green and gold, though House Tyrell had effectively collapsed and was now represented by distant cousins. There were Riverlanders bearing the trout of House Tully. Sansa felt a twinge of recognition for her mother's heritage. Sprinkled among them, she saw Stormlanders, Reachmen, Knights from the Vale. The Vale contingent was smaller than she expected, a sign that the lords there still had not fully recovered from the havoc Baelish had wrought. She half wondered if Lady Anya Waynwood or Lord Royce would arrive eventually. She moved through the throng, exchanging polite greetings. Many eyes flicked to the stark sigil on her cloak. She could sense their curiosity, their caution. If any recognized her face from the earlier days, they made no mention of it, though she did catch a few startled glances. A tall knight from the Stormlands bowed deeply when she paused to greet him, addressing her as "my lady." While a group of Dornish courtiers observed from a distance, their expressions veiled behind courtesy. She gleaned small snippets of conversation. Talk of the city's grain shortage, concerns about roaming Sellsword companies, hushed mentions of a rumored Lannister champion who might appear to defend Cersei's claims. She made mental notes of everything, letting her time in King's Landing guide her once more. Always listen, gather every stray word, for they might be the key to unraveling plots. After a polite circuit, she retreated to the cooler air of a side corridor, where the press of bodies thinned. She stood near a stone column, scanning the courtyard with measured detachment. Her gaze settled on a short, silver-haired woman in conversation with several knights, her attire of pale blue silk embroidered with a three-headed dragon in silver thread. A Targaryen loyalist, perhaps. The woman's expression was intense, eyes shining with conviction as she gestured to the knights. Sansa watched carefully, noting the color of the dragon. Silver, not black or red. Possibly a lesser branch or a claimant's retainer. She tucked the observation away. The Targaryen presence had long been rumored after Daenerys Targaryen's attempt to reclaim the throne, but how it stood now, none could say with certainty. Sansa had only scraps of rumor. She needed facts. A throat cleared nearby. She turned to see a familiar figure stepping into the corridor. Ser Brienne of Tarth. Relief and warmth filled Sansa's heart at the sight of the tall woman. Brienne wore her armor, scuffed from travel, her blue eyes earnest as ever. Sansa felt a pang of gratitude. Here was someone she trusted implicitly. "Ser Brienne," Sansa said with a gentle smile. "I wasn't sure I'd see you here." Brienne bowed her head respectfully, her voice quiet. "My lady, I returned with the envoy from Riverrun. I heard you had arrived." Sansa reached to clasp Brienne's gauntlet hand. "I'm glad to see you safe. Is Podrick with you?" "Yes, my lady, he's tending to the horses. The roads were rough, but we managed well enough. And you? How was your journey from Winterfell?" "Tiring, but we made it without incident," Sansa replied, glancing past Brienne's shoulder at the swirling knots of lords and ladies. "Have you gleaned anything of the council's likely outcome?" Brienne's expression was grave. Many factions, many claimants. Some speak of placing a king from among the major houses, others of choosing a ruler by vote as they did in the past, though that's a practice rarely honored. There's talk of a Targaryen claimant still alive in Essos, or perhaps in hiding. There are Lannister loyalists propping up one of Cersei's cousins, or so the rumor goes. I can't say which faction has the strongest support. Sansa's lips pressed together. And what of the North's place in all this? Brienne paused. From what I hear, some houses expect the North to submit to whichever monarch is chosen, to rejoin the fold. Others think you might declare for an independent kingdom. The city gossips are uncertain. They whisper about you, my lady, that you have become formidable. Some of them are afraid. Sansa nodded, absorbing the information. She recalled how her mother once told her fear was sometimes an advantage, so long as you did not let it curdle into hatred. The future is uncertain, she said quietly, and I have no intention of letting the North be trampled again. But we shall see how this council proceeds. She considered Brienne's unwavering gaze. Thank you for your loyalty, Sir Brienne. Will you attend me, as you once did? Brienne stood straighter. Of course, my lady. If it pleases you, I will stay by your side. I vowed to protect you. Sansa felt a pang of warmth. It pleases me more than I can say. Let me speak with Jon. I'm sure we can arrange a place for you with our company. With that settled, she and Brienne began a quiet circuit of the keep's periphery, exchanging the news they had each gathered. Sansa learned that some delegations had arrived days earlier. Men of the Reach under the banner of House Peak, Riverlanders loyal to House Mallister, Stormlanders led by a distant Baratheon cousin. All were jostling for position ahead of the council. The city thrummed with tension, for no one knew if the council would choose an empty figurehead or if the lords might tear one another apart in the process. Such confusion reminded Sansa of the power vacuum after Robert Baratheon's death, when backroom deals and intrigues had shaped the fate of nations. She resolved to be prepared. They parted ways as mid-morning arrived, Brienne heading off to find Podrick, while Sansa wandered deeper into the keep's halls. She was heading toward the throne room almost involuntarily, drawn by a desire to see that place again, to stand where so many had stood before. Perhaps she wanted to gauge how she would feel in that hall where Joffrey had once terrorized her. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the massive doors. A pair of gold cloaks guarded the entrance, but they stood aside when she drew near, presumably recognizing her rank and name. Inside, she found the throne room largely empty, its high vaulted ceiling still impressive in the morning light. Sunbeams spilled through stained glass windows, illuminating the floor. The Iron Throne itself loomed atop its dais, an ugly mass of twisted swords. Sansa paused at the threshold, memories washing over her in a wave. She remembered standing here before Joffrey, terror choking her throat, praying for some mercy that never came. She remembered how the courtiers had jeered or stared with pity. She remembered the day her father had tried to speak truth in this very hall, only to be undone by cunning he had not foreseen. Now the space was quiet, only a few attendants milling about. The throne seemed almost smaller than she recalled, but no less forbidding. She forced herself to approach, one measured step at a time, ignoring the flutter in her stomach. This was the seat that so many had died for, the seat her father had died trying to protect. She let out a soft breath, remembering the last time she'd glimpsed it, perhaps at Joffrey's wedding feast, though she'd been half-crazed with dread then. A flicker of anger sparked in her chest. So many horrors for that twisted chair of melted steel. Strange, is it not? Came a voice from behind her. She turned, startled to see Tyrion Lannister stepping from a side alcove, watching her with those mismatched eyes. He wore a dark surcoat with no house sigil in sight, his hair more streaked with silver than before. There was a tightness about his features, a wariness, as though he too remembered the cruelty of this place. That we keep returning to this contraption, after everything it has cost us. For a heartbeat, Sansa did not speak. She had not known Tyrion was in the city. Their relationship had been a twisted tangle of forced marriage and, oddly, the kindest Lannister she had ever known. She allowed a polite nod. Lord Tyrion. He offered a small, ironic bow. Lady Stark. Or is it Lady of Winterfell now? Forgive me, I lose track of titles these days. Lady of Winterfell will suffice. She measured her words carefully. She did not resent Tyrion as she once resented his family, but her trust in any Lannister was guarded. Yet she remembered that he had tried to protect her in his own way, once. I hadn't heard you were in King's Landing. His lips curved in a grim smile. I arrived a few days ago, by invitation or so the letter claimed. The city doesn't exactly roll out the welcome for Lannisters these days, not after. He let the words trail off, his gaze flicking to the Iron Throne. I have no illusions about how most people regard my name. She studied him. Tyrion had always been clever, always walking a knife's edge between defiance and cynicism. Why are you here, then? Are you representing your house? He half laughed. My house is in shambles. A few cousins cling to the Westerlands. Yes, but the name Lannister doesn't command the same awe it once did. I suppose I'm here as a remnant, or perhaps a curiosity. The Great Council summoned influential voices, and whether or not they like me, I was once the hand of the king. Some might think I've knowledge to share. Sansa inclined her head, stepping a little farther from the dais so they could speak more privately. The throne, looming in her peripheral vision, set her on edge. What knowledge? Tyrion shrugged. Which alliances are possible, which are doomed to fail? Who might be bribed to support a particular claimant? It's all a bit tedious. I considered returning to Pentos, but I thought I might see this realm attempt to restore some form of order. Morbid curiosity, perhaps. She gave a slight nod. And your sister? Is she? Cersei. His expression darkened. Gone. Vanished before the city fell during the final battles. Some say she's dead. Others claim she fled overseas. There are a few Lannister bannermen who say she's alive and in hiding. I wish I knew. But if you're worried about her conjuring some new horror, fear not. She'd find little purchase in this city now. The people revile her for the destruction she oversaw. Sansa let out a slow breath. The fate of Cersei Lannister had haunted many, but the realm was rife with rumors, each wilder than the last. If Tyrion didn't know, likely no one did. And you? She asked. What do you hope to gain here? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps a bit of redemption, if that's still possible. He folded his hands behind his back. I suspect the realm might choose a new name for the throne, or tear itself apart trying. I'd prefer to nudge it toward some measure of stability if I can. A stable realm is good for everyone, after all. She sensed sincerity in his words, tempered by the cynicism of a man who had seen too much. Once, Tyrion had been kinder to her than any other Lannister. But trust was not something she gave freely anymore. We shall see if stability is even possible. He nodded. We shall. His gaze flicked to her face. And you, Lady Sansa? If the Great Council looks to the north for guidance, what will you say? I imagine many southern lords hope you'll kneel to whoever is chosen, preserving the old arrangement. She studied him in silence for a moment. What I desire is for the north to be safe, to be respected. The realm has let the north bleed too many times. I won't let that happen again. Tyrion smiled faintly, an understanding glimmer in his eyes. Wise. I suppose if that means the north stands apart, many lords will balk. But after everything, well, perhaps it's your right. The world has changed. She thought back to the day they stood on the dais at the Purple Wedding, how he refused to humiliate her even though Joffrey demanded it. In the end, Tyrion had tried in his own way. No matter what the southern lords think, I won't yield the north's well-being. I learned that lesson. She let her voice grow quiet. They taught it to me here in this very city. Tyrion inclined his head in sympathy. Then I wish you well in that pursuit. If I can help you navigate the thornier aspects of the council, perhaps we might talk further. As you know, few can parse the southern lord's intrigues quite like I can. He hesitated, then continued softly, though I understand if you'd prefer I keep my distance. My name is not the most welcome. She regarded him. Her instincts told her to be cautious, but another part of her recalled that Tyrion was rarely guided by malice toward her. "I'll consider it," she said at length, "though I make no promises." "Of course," he said, bowing with a flourish. "My lady." With that, he turned and departed, his footsteps echoing across the hall. Sansa found herself alone again, the Iron Throne looming in front of her. She walked a slow circle around its dais, remembering how Baelish had once spoken of climbing chaos like a ladder. So many had died for the right to sit upon that monstrous seat. She realized that she held no desire for it. She wanted only to safeguard the North from the very brand of chaos that had devoured her family. If the new realm insisted upon a single monarch, let it be someone wise enough not to trample the North. And if they refused to respect that boundary, she would not yield. Her time in King's Landing had taught her that illusions were powerful, but so was unwavering resolve. She would use both if she must. She left the throne room with her heart steady. The day passed in a flurry of small meetings. She took a midday meal with Jon and a few other northern lords, discussing news that the Vale's contingent had arrived and would be housed near them. She briefly caught a glimpse of Lord Royce in the corridor, a man who had once eyed Baelish with deep suspicion. He bowed respectfully to her, reminding her how far she'd come since the days she posed as Elaine Stone. She also spotted the bright plumage of a Tyrell cousin crossing the courtyard, accompanied by a retinue of lesser lords. The swirl of alliances was beginning. Late in the afternoon, she stood near the keep's outer parapet, surveying the city. From this vantage, she could see the broad waters of Blackwater Bay. The memory of the Battle of the Blackwater flickered across her mind. Flames on the water, green wildfire consuming ships, so much death. The city below looked smaller from here, its miseries distant, but she knew that behind each roof was a story of survival and heartbreak. If King's Landing had taught her anything, it was that the realm was always on the brink of collapse if entrusted solely to those who craved power for its own sake. A northern guard approached and informed her that a messenger from the Vale wished to speak with her. She followed him to a small receiving room where Lord Royce stood, posture straight, gray whiskers bristling. He wore fine traveling leathers with the moon and falcon sigil embroidered at the breast. Sansa greeted him with a polite inclination of her head, recalling how they'd last parted when Baelish still lived. "My Lady Stark," Royce said, voice deep with courtesy. "It has been some time. You've done much for the Vale, seeing to it that Lord Baelish's machinations ended." "I did what I must," Sansa replied calmly, aware he still had many questions about exactly how Lisa Arryn died and how Baelish's role had been exposed, but she felt no need to delve into details. "I'm pleased you arrived safely. Has the Vale recovered from the recent winters?" "In part," he answered, "though it will be years before the scars fully heal. We come to King's Landing to ensure the Vale's voice is heard in whatever arrangement emerges. I trust the North seeks the same." She gave a small nod, considering how frank to be. Lord Royce was blunt but generally honorable. "The North cannot be overlooked. I remember what happened when the Southern Crown disregarded my father's warnings. We will not suffer such a slight again." He inclined his head in solemn acknowledgement. "I understand. The Vale stands as well, ready to ensure the Ares' interests are protected. But perhaps there might be alignment between us? The Vale owes House Stark a debt for your father's old alliances, for your mother's sister's rule, though that ended in tragedy, and for the part the Knights of the Vale played in retaking Winterfell. Your mother was, after all, born of the Riverlands but fostered in the Vale. There is history connecting our houses." Her thoughts flicked to Lisa's letter that had once spurred Ned Stark to come south, setting off a chain of tragic events. But that was the distant past. At least Royce seemed open to cooperation. "We share common ground, yes?" she said. "What do you propose?" He shifted his weight. "If the council selects a monarch, the Vale would accept a ruler that does not subjugate the North or ignore the Vale's autonomy. If you speak for the North and we speak for the Vale, we might ensure that neither region is forced into a ruinous war with the Southern Lords. I'd prefer we stand together rather than leave each to fend for itself." Sansa weighed the possibility. An alliance with the Vale might be beneficial. It would remind the southern lords that the northern border was not to be trifled with. But she also knew the Vale might attempt to use that alliance to secure its own demands. She recalled how Baelish had manipulated the lords of the Vale for personal gain. Still, she saw advantage here. "I'm open to discussing terms. Perhaps we can meet again tomorrow to speak more concretely." Royce bowed. "Very well, my lady. With your permission, I shall bring a small retinue of Vale lords who represent our interests. We will find common ground, I'm sure." She agreed, and he departed, leaving her alone with her guard. The notion of forging alliances so soon after arriving made her reflect on the difference between her younger self and the woman she had become. Once, she would have found such negotiations daunting, but now she recognized them as essential. This was the Game of Thrones. Forging alliances, ensuring survival, preventing betrayal by preempting it with diplomatic strength. That evening, she and Jon received more visitors in their chambers. Lesser lords from the north, plus a lord from the Westerlands who sought to gauge whether House Stark would champion a new Lannister leader. She refused to commit to anything beyond polite words. Jon looked ill at ease through the negotiations, preferring more direct talk, but Sansa guided the conversation, employing the same courtesy she had learned in the Red Keep under dire circumstances. She read the Westerner's intentions quickly. He wanted to see if the North might be swayed to restore some measure of Lannister influence. She gave him nothing definitive, letting him leave with only the impression that House Stark was willing to listen but not easily courted. Afterward, Jon exhaled in frustration, saying he preferred the honesty of swords to the dance of words. Sansa felt a flicker of sympathy, but she reminded him that a sword could not carve alliances that might prevent a war. He nodded grudgingly. By the time she retired that night, the city's bells were tolling the late hour. She found her bedchamber quiet, the shutters closed against a cold breeze. Slipping off her cloak, she sat on the edge of the bed, her mind churning. Memories of her father flickered again. He had dreaded court intrigue, hoping to rule with fairness and open truth. Yet that approach had not saved him from treachery. She had learned that cunning must exist alongside honor. The question remained, would the rest of the realm accept that? Sleep came fitfully, dreams filled with the faces of old tormentors. She saw Joffrey sneering, Baelish whispering, Cersei smirking from the shadows. She woke once, heart pounding, reminded that each had tried to shape her as a pawn, but she was no pawn anymore. When dawn broke, she rose feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The Great Council would convene the next day. There was still time for final maneuvers, final alliances. She intended to use it well. She spent the morning forging a small alliance with the Riverlands representatives, men loyal to House Tully. While she had no illusions that all Riverlords would follow her mother's kin with unwavering loyalty, some still respected the Stark name enough to entertain the notion of a mutual defense pact. Sansa played upon their longing for stability. Farmland in the Riverlands had been ravaged by wars, many peasants uprooted, trade routes disrupted. If the North promised shipments of timber or grain once their own supplies recovered, in exchange for safe passage on the Trident, that might foster a beneficial relationship. The negotiations were delicate, but Sansa recognized a kernel of opportunity. She concluded the talks with an agreement to meet again after the council, leaving the Riverlords with the impression that House Stark was open to deeper ties. In truth, she simply wished to ensure that if tensions flared, they would think twice before siding against the North. Around midday, she took Arya's counsel privately. Her sister had spent the morning exploring the keep in her own subtle way, slipping past unsuspecting guards and listening to stray conversations. Arya seemed half restless, half disgusted by the city's hypocrisy. Yet she offered tidbits of useful intelligence. For one, a group of men from the Stormlands had been overheard speaking with a Braavosi envoy, possibly discussing loans or sellswords. For another, a certain envoy from Dorne had asked pointedly about the Stark stance on independence. Arya explained this with a slight shrug, as though the intricacies of court bored her. But Sansa pressed further, gleaning that the Dornish might be sympathetic to the idea that each region should have greater autonomy. Another angle to consider. Arya looked at Sansa with faint amusement after sharing all this. You do realize how many hours I had to listen to their nonsense, lurking in corners, just to gather these scraps? I'm not sure it was worth it. Sansa gave a small smile. It is worth it. Each scrap of knowledge forms a piece of the puzzle. If we're to protect the North, we must know what these factions want. She placed a hand lightly on Arya's shoulder. Thank you. Her sister rolled her eyes but allowed a brief grin. I prefer a sword in hand, but I suppose eavesdropping can be a weapon in its own way. That afternoon, Sansa ventured again into the courtyard, accompanied by Jon, Ser Brienne, and a handful of guards. A hush fell among various delegations as they noticed the northern party approach. An official from the Crownlands, someone with a slender mustache and a pompous air, greeted them with flowery compliments, offering to show them the newly repaired audience chamber where the Great Council would meet. Sansa accepted, stepping inside to examine the hall. The repairs were evident. New wooden benches, a dais at the front. Banners of various houses ringed the walls. Stark, Martell, Baratheon, Tully, Arryn, Greyjoy, and even Lannister. She noticed how tattered some were, presumably from the wars. Standing near the dais was a cluster of men in conversation. One wore a doublet bearing the sigil of House Hightower, another the old Sun and Spear of Dorne. They turned, noticing Sansa's entrance, and their expressions flickered with curiosity and a hint of caution. Jon studied the hall with folded arms. It's small, the official coughed, forcing a smile. A more intimate setting was deemed preferable for negotiations. The throne room is perhaps too imposing for a council meant to foster cooperation. He cleared his throat. Not all the lords will attend in person, but their delegates shall. We anticipate spirited debate. Sansa walked slowly, her gaze trailing over the benches. Here the future of the realm would be hammered out, for good or ill. She sensed the swirling possibilities. A single monarch chosen, multiple claimants each refusing to yield, or an agreement that each region govern itself. The tension in her shoulders reminded her that the outcome could shape generations. She lingered near the dais. Who is presiding? The official gave a slight bow. There will be a neutral moderator, chosen from among those deemed least partisan. Lord Edmure Tully's name was put forth, as well as Lord Royce of the Vale and Lord Glover. The council might decide once we convene. Sansa nodded. Edmure Tully was her uncle, though she had not seen him in quite some time. He was a decent man, if not the most politically shrewd. She wondered how he had fared through the wars. Royce was strong-willed, but could come off as overly stern. Glover was one of the North's staunch defenders, not quite neutral. The arrangement would be complicated, but she held her tongue and merely thanked the official for the explanation. Outside, the sun was descending toward the horizon, bathing the courtyard in golden light. She saw new arrivals pulling into the keep, a column of riders bearing an unfamiliar banner, a crossed trident over a golden sun, possibly a newly risen house in the Stormlands or an offshoot from the Reach. The meltdown of old loyalties had birthed a slew of smaller houses jockeying for recognition. Sansa felt the weight of too many moving pieces, but she remained steady. She had learned that the only path was forward. Retreat was not an option. That evening, final preparations occupied her. She drafted letters to be sent north, updating the lords at Winterfell on the swirling political climate, and ensuring the garrisons remained on alert. She wrote as well to White Harbor, instructing them to maintain vigilance over trade routes. She wanted no surprises if the southern lords made demands. Jon oversaw some of the northern knights, reminding them to stay disciplined, to avoid brawls or drunkenness that might mar their reputation. Arya vanished again into the city, returning late with word of more back-alley whispers. All converged on the same point. Tomorrow's council would be a turning point. At dawn, she dressed in a gown of deep gray velvet with modest silver embroidery, her hair braided into a northern style. She pinned the direwolf brooch at her shoulder, letting it rest plainly for all to see. Jon stood waiting in the antechamber, clad in dark leather and fur-trimmed cloak. Arya was nowhere to be seen. Likely she would slip in or watch from a vantage. Brienne arrived to escort them, flanked by a handful of northern guards. In Sile, NCE, they made their way to the council hall. Outside the hall, the corridors were choked with lords, ladies, knights, and envoys, each wearing their colors or house insignia. Murmured conversations swelled, a tide of cautious words and measured greetings. Sansa caught glimpses of houses from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms, some so obscure she barely recognized them. The tension in the air was palpable, like a gathering storm about to unleash. She saw Tyrion across the way, standing alone, surveying the crowd with a sardonic tilt of his head. Their eyes met briefly, and he offered a subtle incline of his chin. She allowed a slight nod, nothing more. At length, the doors opened, and people began filing in, taking seats on benches arranged in concentric arcs. Sansa and Jon sat together near the front, accompanied by a few northern lords. The dais at the head of the hall remained empty while the rest settled. A hush descended, broken by occasional coughs or shifting feet. Looking around, Sansa noted the presence of Lord Royce, a cluster of Vale lords, Dorne's delegation, several tall knights from the Reach, the River Lords with Edmure Tully among them, Westerland's lords with uncertain expressions, and the Iron Islands contingent, a pair of stern-faced Greyjoy men. Even a few men from House Reed in the Neck were there, nodding politely to the Starks. Everywhere she turned, she saw watchful faces. A herald stepped forward, voice echoing off the chamber walls. "Lords, ladies, and esteemed delegates, we gather under the summons of the Great Council to determine the governance and future of these Seven Kingdoms. Let it be known that all here have the right to speak, and that we convene in hopes of unity and peace." He paused, scanning the crowd. "The first matter before us, who shall moderate this council until a suitable arrangement is decided?" Immediately, voices rose. Some called for Edmure Tully, others for Lord Royce, others for an impartial lesser house. Sansa remained silent, letting the factions jostle. Jon watched with a slight scowl, and Sansa placed a steadying hand on his arm. Eventually, after a bout of debate, Edmure Tully was chosen, likely due to his tenuous claim to neutrality. Sansa heard more than one mutter that Tully was easy to manipulate, though she hoped her uncle might at least manage the proceedings without bungling them entirely. Edmure took his place at the dais, looking slightly anxious, but he raised his hands for quiet. And so the council began. The next hours were a blur of arguments, proposals, and claims. The Lord of House Peak put forth the notion of returning to a Targaryen monarchy, claiming to have knowledge of a surviving Targaryen across the sea. The Westerland's lords insisted that only a strong monarch from the old blood of the West could restore order, eyeing each other with forced smiles. The Iron Islanders demanded near independence, referencing the vow once made to grant them more autonomy. The men of Dorne hinted that they might prefer the same for themselves. Sansa listened keenly, noticing how quickly the conversation fragmented. Everyone wanted something. The question was whether they could be brought to any consensus. Jon leaned towards Sansa, whispering, "This is madness. They're all squabbling over half-truths." She hushed him softly, murmuring back, "Let them show their cards. We'll speak when the time is right." Lord Royce of the Vale stood at one point, stating that the Vale would not accept any southern king who imposed crippling taxes or who allowed chaos to threaten their mountain passes. Another stood to propose a council of regents from each region with a rotating monarchy, an idea that drew laughter from some corners. Others recommended dividing the realm entirely. The swirl of debate continued. Sansa kept track of who argued what. Many lords seemed hesitant to wholly commit, waiting to see which faction gained momentum. Amid the uproar, Tyrion Lannister took the floor, speaking in a calm, measured tone. "My lords and ladies, we have seen what befalls a realm that cannot find unity. We have also seen the ruin of tyranny. If we are to appoint a monarch, that monarch must be chosen not by birthright alone, but by the will of those assembled." He glanced around. "We must consider who can unite us, not by threat or gold, but by respect." A murmured ripple went through the hall. Sansa recognized echoes of Tyrion's old cunning here. He was shaping the argument toward a more open choice. Edmure Tully coughed and asked if Tyrion had a candidate in mind. Tyrion's gaze flicked toward Sansa, then Jon, then elsewhere. I do not bring you a simple name on a piece of parchment. Rather, I suggest we weigh who among us has the qualities needed. We have men and women in this chamber who have proven themselves in war, in governance, in forging alliances. Perhaps we should hear from them. A wave of nods, though some scowled. Sansa's pulse quickened. She wondered if Tyrion intended to propose Jon as a candidate. That would complicate everything, especially given Jon's own feelings. She kept her face still, though she felt Jon tense beside her. The council devolved again as various lords began nominating themselves or others. A tall Stormlander claimed right through some distant Targaryen lineage. A Reachman insisted on the old blood of Garth Greenhand's line. A few proposed that the throne remain vacant and each region rule itself. Sansa noticed that last suggestion garnered more murmurs of approval than she'd expected. The memory of the War of the Five Kings was still fresh. The realm was weary of monarchy if it meant endless battles. Dorne's delegation nodded in silent agreement with the talk of independence, and the Iron Islanders grunted in approval. Sansa slowly rose from her seat, heart pounding but expression poised. Edmure noticed and gestured for silence. All eyes turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their attention. But she stood as she had stood in the Red Keep many times before, only now with confidence. She addressed the hall clearly. Lords and ladies, you know I am Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell. The North has suffered much in these wars, paying in blood and ruin. My father came south in good faith to serve the crown, and he was betrayed. My family was torn apart, my people devastated. She paused, letting her words resonate. And yet we fought for this realm against threats beyond imagining. We stood against the Night King, sacrificing more lives than I care to count, to save everyone who breathes in these 7 kingdoms. The North has bled for the South before, and it will not do so again if we receive only neglect and empty promises. A few calls of approval echoed from the northern benches. She continued, voice calm, if we are to remain a single realm, then the crown must prove it respects each region's autonomy, particularly the North's. Otherwise, the North has no reason to bend the knee. We have learned the cost of trusting in kings who do not care for us. If you ask the North to rejoin, you must grant us a treaty that ensures we will never again be forsaken or exploited. The hall erupted in murmurs. Some bristled, but others looked thoughtful. Edmure Tully cleared his throat, trying to restore order, asking Sansa if she proposed full independence. She glanced around, aware of every eye upon her, including Jon's. We consider it, she said, but we also consider the possibility of unity, provided our rights, our safety, and our authority over our own lands are guaranteed beyond question. A wave of discussion surged again. Dorne's envoy spoke up, supporting the idea of a realm in which each region had greater sovereignty. One of the Westerland's lords scoffed, saying that a realm with such fragmentation would collapse into lawlessness. The debate went back and forth. Sansa sensed that, for all the clamor, they might be inching towards something new. Tyrion observed quietly from a side bench, a faint smile ghosting his lips, as though he recognized that Sansa's stance carried considerable weight. Then a slender man with silver-white hair stood, wearing a pale blue cloak embroidered with a faint dragon sigil. He claimed to speak for a Targaryen who remained in exile in Essos. We must unite under the rightful blood of the dragon, he declared, voice shaking with fervor. He went on about how Daenerys Targaryen had nearly reclaimed the throne but was betrayed, that her cause lived on through some distant kin. Sansa listened, recalling the rumors of Daenerys's attempt years prior, the dragons that burned through armies. The memory was enough to chill her. The man insisted that the realm's survival lay in continuing the Targaryen line. His words garnered a few cheers but also a handful of jeers. Lord Royce rose, stony-faced, and stated that the Vale would not accept rule by an unknown exile with questionable claims. The Targaryen envoy bristled, the two trading barbed words. A Stormlander called out that unless the Targaryen returned in person, they had no standing. Tension crackled. Sansa saw fists clenched on weapon hilts. She inhaled slowly, recalling 1,000 small lessons from King's Landing. Let the hotheads have their moment. Remain steady until you see a chance to direct the energy. Finally, Edmure Tully hammered a small gavel on the dais, calling for calm. We shall recess for the midday meal, he declared. Take these hours to confer. We reconvene in the afternoon, and perhaps then we can narrow our path forward. A collective sigh of relief came as the crowd began to file out. Sansa sank back into her seat for a moment, massaging her temples. The swirl of voices felt oppressive, but she was not disheartened. She recognized that chaos often preceded significant change. Jon placed a hand on her shoulder. You spoke well. She nodded. Thank you. Though she wondered if her words might have unsettled some houses who still dreamed of the North kneeling quietly. Better they know the truth now, she thought. They left the hall with Brienne at their side, weaving through the corridors. Sansa felt adrenaline humming in her veins, the same tension she recalled before a battle. This was a different kind of war, fought with words. She led them to a small garden courtyard that had once been her sanctuary in times of fear. The fountain there still trickled, though some of the statuary was broken. She took a breath, letting the crisp air steady her. Jon looked weary, as though he hated every moment spent inside that hall of squabbling lords. She sympathized but did not share it aloud. A voice behind them made them turn. Tyrion again, stepping into the courtyard with measured strides. Lady Sansa, Lord Snow, he began, dipping his head. Might I have a moment of your time? Jon bristled a little, but Sansa nodded. Speak. He paused near the fountain, studying them. The council is fractious, but it need not be aimless. If you and the North throw weight behind a credible monarch, one who will honor your demands for autonomy, you could shape the outcome. Without your voice, many lords will be left in doubt. Most would rather avoid a war with the North. If you name a candidate, that might settle the matter. Jon frowned. We don't want the Iron Throne. Tyrion's gaze slid to Jon briefly, then back to Sansa. I'm aware, but is there anyone you might find acceptable? Someone you trust to keep the peace, respect the North, and unify the rest? Because if no one emerges, the realm may well fragment. Dorne wants autonomy, the Iron Islands want independence, the Vale wants security, the Reach wants stability. And many want a king or queen they can rally behind. So it's either multiple broken kingdoms or one kingdom under a chosen ruler. If the North endorses no one, the vacuum might lead to conflict. Sansa thought carefully. She didn't relish crowning a stranger. She'd have considered Jon, but she knew his heart lay in the North. And if she proposed Jon, it would bring fresh chaos. He carried Targaryen blood, after all, even if it was not widely known to all. Another war might ensue if that detail surfaced. She recalled glimpses of other claimants or potential leaders. Edmure Tully was decent but lacked presence. Lord Royce was too rigid. Dorne offered no single figure who commanded universal respect. Perhaps there was no perfect candidate. She looked Tyrion in the eye. We will not declare anything until we see an arrangement that truly benefits the North. We've proposed the possibility of independence or some formal treaty guaranteeing our rights. Let the others show us they can abide by it. Then we might choose to support a single monarch. If such a person convinces us they'll honor our terms. Tyrion nodded thoughtfully. Reasonable. And if no such person emerges? She lifted her chin. Then the North stands alone. Jon's jaw tightened in agreement. We have no interest in meddling further. We've seen enough war. Tyrion exhaled. I can't say I blame you, but keep in mind, if multiple regions break away, the others might see that as an invitation for expansion or conquest. We could spiral back into endless petty wars. Sansa's voice was soft yet firm. Then let the lords see that war with the North would cost them dearly. If they prefer to avoid that cost, they'll meet us at the table. He inclined his head, half smiling. You've learned well from the cruelty of this place, my lady. A pity that it takes so much suffering to produce such resolve. She did not return the smile. Cruelty should not be the teacher of any child. But we cannot change the past. We can only shape what lies ahead. They parted ways. Sansa and Jon returned to their chambers for a quick meal, speaking in hushed tones about whether any candidate might appear who could unify the realm without threatening the North. Jon, exasperated, muttered they should have stayed in Winterfell, but Sansa reminded him that avoiding the council entirely would have left their fate in southern hands. At least here they had a voice. Arya slipped in partway through their meal, dropping onto a bench with an airy sigh, complaining of how tiresome the city's politics were. But she added that she'd overheard a conversation among the Dornish delegates. They seemed more willing than most to accept a new arrangement, one that recognized multiple powers. Sansa stored that insight for later. When the afternoon session resumed, the tension in the hall felt even stronger. Some lords' voices were hoarse from earlier debates, yet they continued doggedly. Proposals and counter-proposals flew, many contradictory. The Targaryen loyalist insisted an anointed Targaryen was en route. The Stormlanders denied it. The Reachmen proposed a caretaker monarchy with limited powers. Dorne pressed for near independence. The Iron Islands demanded the same. Through it all, Sansa waited, occasionally exchanging quiet words with Jon or the Northern Lords. Finally, as the day wore on, Edmure Tully's voice cracked with weariness. We cannot continue this back and forth. We must either choose a monarch or choose dissolution of the realm. Is there a compromise that satisfies both? Or must the 7 kingdoms become separate once more? A hush rippled. Sansa saw eyes turning her way, and also toward the Dornish seats, the Iron Islanders, the Vale. No single voice rose to claim the throne. The Westerland's lords seemed hesitant to push for a Lannister restoration, likely seeing it as futile. Sansa let the silence stretch. She felt a moment of possibility. Perhaps the realm would indeed unravel, each region forging its own path. Then Tyrion Lannister stood again. If I may propose something, there is a way to ensure unity without condemning the North or any region to forced subjugation. He surveyed the hall. In other lands, there is a practice of electing a king to rule for life, but that king's heirs do not automatically inherit. Each time a monarch dies, the lords gather and choose a successor. This ensures the realm has a capable ruler, rather than a child who might be ill-suited. Should we adopt such a system, each region might retain significant autonomy, answering only to the crown on matters of war or realm-wide policy, while local governance remains with the regional lords. The North, Dorne, the Vale, the Iron Islands, all keep their own traditions, but we stand together against external threats. The chosen monarch's power is limited by the knowledge that the next great council can replace them if they overreach. It would be a monarchy, but not strictly hereditary. Something new. A stunned quiet. Whispers flared. Sansa's mind raced. This was reminiscent of how some free cities operated, or how the Night's Watch chose its Lord Commander, though that was a far simpler institution. She glanced at Jon, who blinked in surprise. She recalled how Peter Baelish had once said chaos was a ladder. Tyrion was now using that chaos to propose a drastically different arrangement. Many in the hall reacted. Some southwestern lords scoffed, calling the idea ridiculous. But others looked intrigued. It solved the problem of a single house dominating forever. It might keep the peace by giving each region a voice in who wore the crown. The Iron Islanders still demanded full independence, and the Dornish were uncertain, but the notion had traction. If the monarchy's powers were curtailed, perhaps that would be acceptable to the North. Sansa could see potential. Tyrion pressed his advantage, appealing to the weariness of the realm, the desire to avoid further bloodshed. Edmure Tully hammered his gavel for quiet again, turning to Sansa. Lady of Winterfell, would the North accept such a compromise? A chosen monarchy with limited authority, leaving each region largely autonomous. Sansa stood once more, every muscle tense. She could feel dozens of eyes boring into her. The North is not eager to be under another southern ruler, she began, voice clear. But if this council formalizes real autonomy, allowing us to govern ourselves in peace while only answering the crown on issues that affect all of us, then the North might consider it. We must see the exact terms. The North will not blindly consent to indefinite obligations. And if a monarch chosen by this council breaks faith with us, we must have the right to withdraw. Her statement stirred more whispers, but she saw nods from the Dornish seats. Possibly they felt similarly. The Iron Islands might demand their own terms, but the conversation was shifting. The prospect of an elective monarchy, with each region free to keep its own laws and governance, seemed to quell some of the tension. Sansa recognized that some lords might prefer a more traditional approach, but so many years of war and uncertainty had sapped the appetite for absolute rule. Perhaps this was the middle ground. She felt a cautious spark of hope. The remainder of the session was spent haggling over details. The Iron Islanders insisted on reaffirming the old arrangement that gave them freedoms at sea. The Dornish demanded no interference in their inheritance laws. The Vale asked for absolute autonomy within their borders. The Reach demanded trade protections. Sansa remained firm in her demands that the North control its own taxes, mustering of soldiers, and internal governance. If a monstrous threat like the Night King ever arose again, they would unite. Otherwise, the North would not be bullied. Lord Royce concurred for the Vale, and gradually a framework took shape. Not a single realm in the old sense, but a loose confederation under a chosen king or queen who would handle foreign threats, major conflicts, and general unity. The key question, of course, was, who would they choose first? The lords began murmuring about possible candidates. Tyrion's name was mentioned, but many scoffed at a Lannister monarchy, even an elective one. Someone proposed Edmure Tully, but the reaction was lukewarm. Then a Stormlander spoke up for a near-forgotten Baratheon cousin. Sansa and Jon exchanged glances, each uncertain. Arya, seated behind them now, grumbled that she'd had enough of Southerners. Sansa agreed in spirit, but the new arrangement might not be so dire if it truly protected the North. Eventually, the hour grew late. Edmure Tully called for an adjournment until morning, at which point the council would vote. That night, the city buzzed with anxious anticipation. Secret meetings abounded. Sansa found herself approached by multiple lords seeking the North's support for their preferred candidate. She offered polite evasions, not committing, though she gleaned many details of each claimant's history. Jon, tired of the politicking, retreated to their chambers, but Sansa soldiered on, determined not to miss any crucial piece of information. She recognized this was the final jockeying before the vote. If she chose a side prematurely, she might lose leverage. Late into the night, she sat by the hearth in her chamber, mind spinning with possibilities. Arya dozed in a chair, arms crossed, while Brienne stood guard by the door, stifling yawns. Jon had gone to his own room to rest. Sansa's eyes burned from fatigue, but she forced herself to think it through. If the new monarchy was truly elective and limited in power, who was the best candidate? If they chose poorly, the realm might descend again into strife. If they chose well, the North could enjoy peace and autonomy. She thought of every name bandied about: Stormland cousins, minor Targaryen claimants, a scattered few from the Westerlands. None inspired much confidence. A voice in her mind whispered of Jon Snow. He had the lineage, though quietly. He had the respect of many, but he had no desire for it, and revealing his Targaryen blood might stoke old fires. She thought of herself. Did she want that seat? No, she desired only to protect the North. And though she might rule justly, she knew many southern lords would balk at a Stark monarchy. The realm was not ready for that. Perhaps the best outcome was for them to choose a compromise candidate who was neither divisive nor powerless. But who fit that mold? Sansa exhaled, remembering how King's Landing had once devoured her father's sense of justice. Now she stood at the precipice of a new structure that might or might not succeed. In that moment, she felt the weight of history. The next day would be decisive. Dawn arrived too soon. Sansa rose, exhausted, but resolute. She dressed in a warm gray cloak, pinned again with the direwolf sigil, and made her way to the council hall. The tension crackled even more than before. Lords took their seats, exchanging guarded looks. The dais remained empty until Edmure Tully arrived, flanked by a few stewards. He called the assembly to order, voice unsteady. Sansa noticed Tyrion off to the side, calm but watchful. She wondered if he had some final trick in mind. The herald announced the business: the election of a monarch under the newly drafted arrangement, with each region retaining broad autonomy. The hall collectively inhaled. Edmure cleared his throat. "We have heard proposals, and we have the terms hammered out in principle. If we indeed adopt an elective monarchy, we must choose our first monarch to preside under these conditions." A hush. The Stormlander who had championed a Baratheon cousin rose, praising the merits of his candidate. The Targaryen loyalist insisted no monarchy could be valid without the dragon's blood. The Iron Islanders scoffed at them all, but recognized they had no strong candidate of their own. Dorne sat silent, lips pressed thin. The Westerlands offered the name of a lesser Lannister, but half-heartedly. Then Lord Royce stood. "My lords, if we are to trust a monarch to handle realm-wide matters, let us choose someone with proven leadership in times of crisis. Someone who has known both war and compassion, who has no thirst for tyranny." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I propose Ser Brienne of Tarth." A wave of astonished murmurs rippled through the hall. Royce continued, "She is of noble birth from the Stormlands. She served gallantly under multiple kings. She is renowned for her honor and sense of justice. She has no stake in petty house feuds, no hunger for conquest." Ser Brienne, seated behind Sansa, blanched, stammering. But the hall erupted in debate, many shouting that a woman knight was unprecedented. Others insisted that was precisely why she might be a neutral candidate. Sansa's heart pounded. Brienne was the last person she expected to see nominated. The Stormlanders roared that they had not authorized this. The Reach Lords murmured about tradition. The Iron Islanders looked bemused. In the swirl, another voice called out, "What about Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven?" Heads whipped around. The speaker was a Riverland knight. "He sees more than any of us. He turned the tide during the War for the Dawn. He has no children to create a dynasty." A smattering of agreement, a smattering of confusion. Some had heard rumors of Bran's mystical abilities, but was that a reason to crown him? Sansa's face paled. She looked at Jon, who seemed equally stunned. Bran as king? The idea was not without logic, but it seemed absurd. Did Bran even want that? Did he care for mortal politics, given his deep ties to the old magic? This was madness. The chatter rose, a confusion of voices. Tyrion stepped forward. "If I may," he said loudly, drawing all eyes. "Bran Stark has seen the cost of war. He has no ambition for personal power, and if we are to break the cycle of bloodlines ruling forever, who better than one who cannot father heirs, who comprehends the realm's history more deeply than any living soul? He is known for his wisdom, for his neutrality. If we truly want a monarch chosen by the lords, a monarch who unites us in peace, who better than the three-eyed raven? The boy who became something more." A stunned hush. Sansa felt a swirl of emotions. Shock, a flicker of protectiveness, and a strange sense that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement could work. Bran's gaze had always been distant, as though he saw beyond the mortal plane. Could he truly be a king in an elective system, guiding the realm with measured wisdom, unconcerned with his own house's aggrandizement? She looked to Jon, who wore a troubled expression, and then to the rest of the hall. Whispers spread like wildfire. It was Edmure who eventually spoke. "Does Lord Bran Stark accept this nomination?" Sansa's heart hammered. She saw a hush ripple as all heads turned, searching for Bran. He was in the hall, seated near the back, accompanied by 2 northern guards who had pushed his wheeled chair. Slowly, the guards guided him forward, the crowd parting. Her younger brother, older in spirit than in body, approached the dais. His expression was serene, his eyes calm as a still lake. Sansa could almost feel something uncanny in his presence. He gazed around the hall, his voice quiet but distinct. "I came here because I knew you would need me." The hush was absolute. Edmure swallowed. "Do you accept the crown under the conditions we have discussed? An elective monarchy, each region's autonomy guaranteed, Your powers as monarch limited by this council's authority to depose or replace you if you break the realm's trust. Bran's head tilted slightly, as though listening to distant echoes. If you choose me, I will serve. I do not wish to rule in the old sense, but I will watch and guide and remember. I will do what I can to ensure that no more children need lose their families to war. Gooseflesh prickled along Sansa's arms. She glimpsed tears in Jon's eyes. Arya, leaning against a pillar, seemed uncertain but said nothing. The lords began murmuring. Some found the notion of a boy in a wheeled chair unsettling. Others saw it as an opportunity to shape the monarchy from behind the scenes. Still others recognized that if Bran possessed the knowledge rumored, he might be the best check against tyranny. Slowly, one by one, heads nodded. The Dorne delegate expressed no objection. The Vale Lords signaled acceptance. The River Lords were supportive. The Stormlanders, uncertain at first, realized that if the monarchy had limited power, it hardly mattered, so they shrugged. The Iron Islanders demanded their usual independence clauses be renewed, which the new arrangement already accommodated. In short order, the momentum swung decisively toward Bran. Edmure Tully hammered his gavel, a wry tremble in his voice. All in favor of Bran Stark to be chosen as first king of these new terms, say I. A resounding chorus of I swept the hall. Only the Targaryen loyalist stood in stony silence, but he was a lone voice. Edmure, looking faintly dazed, declared, "Then by the authority of this great council we name Bran Stark, called the Three-Eyed Raven, as king, the first of his name, king of the Undulls and the First Men, lord of the Six Kingdoms and protector of the realm, under the elective system agreed upon by these lords." A wave of applause, mingled with relief, spread through the hall. Sansa felt tears threaten. She glanced at her brother, who met her eyes with a gentle calm. She thought she glimpsed a faint smile. The crowd surged around him, half in awe, half bewildered. Tyrion stepped forward to kneel, then stood, guiding Bran's chair to the dais. Sansa approached, with Jon behind her. Edmure fumbled for a circlet of hammered steel that had been prepared in case a new monarch was chosen. He placed it gently on Bran's head, though it was too large, sliding over his ears. A steward discreetly adjusted it, an awkward but strangely tender moment. The realm had never seen a coronation quite like this. Jon bowed his head to Bran, though he looked torn, remembering the tragedies that had befallen their family. Sansa placed a hand on Bran's arm. "Are you certain?" she whispered. He only inclined his head slightly. "I came because that is why I'm here." She let out a breath. "Then you have the North's blessing," she said aloud, voice steady. "Long may you reign, my king." The next hours were chaos in the best sense. Lords scrambled to pay homage or at least polite respect. Some hammered out final details of the new system. Bran delegated swiftly, asking Tyrion to serve as his hand, for the moment, alongside a small council formed from representatives of each region. Sansa watched carefully, making sure the terms she had demanded were enshrined. The North would remain largely self-governing, loyal to the monarchy only for collective defense and major realm matters. Dorne insisted on the same. Arya hovered at the edges, staying out of the official pomp. Jon, drained, observed with a hint of relief. He had never wanted the burden of rule. This solution freed him. As the lords parted ways, Sansa realized with quiet awe that the Seven Kingdoms were now effectively six under Bran, with the North as an allied but semi-autonomous region, an arrangement not unlike what she'd spoken of. By the day's end, a formal feast was arranged in the half-ruined banquet hall. It was humble by King's Landing standards, with scarce resources, but the mood was oddly joyous. The war-weary lords sensed that perhaps a new page had turned. Sansa joined for a time, though she drank sparingly, keeping her senses alert. She saw Tyrion busily greeting old acquaintances, wearing a faint grin of triumph. She saw Dorne's delegates actually clink glasses with men from the Reach. The tension was not gone, but it had softened. People allowed themselves to laugh. Many eyes strayed to Bran, seated at the high table with his new council. He barely touched his food, but he engaged in quiet conversation, occasionally giving responses that made some lords blink in puzzlement. Sansa suspected he was offering glimpses of knowledge they could scarcely fathom. As the feast wore on, music played. Sansa rose from her seat, stepping aside to stand at the edges of the hall, near a broken pillar. She gazed upon the swirling crowd, remembering the last time she'd attended a feast in King's Landing. It had been Joffrey's wedding, a scene of cruelty and fear. Now the city was battered, but forging a fragile unity. She felt no illusions that everything would be perfect. But it was a step away from the cycle of tyranny and rebellion. Jon found her, a cup of wine in hand, his expression subdued. "I suppose this is how it ends," he said softly. "Bran on the throne. It's not what I expected." She looked at her brother with gentle eyes. "Nor I, but it might be for the best." He exhaled. "Will you remain here for a while?" Sansa shook her head. "I have responsibilities in Winterfell. Once the formalities are handled, I'll return north. That's where I belong." Jon nodded. "I plan to do the same. I need the north. City life isn't for me." She smiled faintly. "You were never one for politics." He gave a soft chuckle. "No, that was always your domain, or at least you learned to handle it better than I ever could." His tone turned earnest. "I'm proud of you, Sansa. Proud of what you became." Her throat tightened. She remembered them as children in Winterfell's courtyard, simpler times before the wars. "We've all changed, Jon." He bowed his head. "Aye." They stood in companionable silence. Across the hall, Bran caught Sansa's gaze, and she sensed a distant affection. He might be king now, but he was still her brother. She would protect the north, while he presided over a realm that might finally know a measure of peace. Perhaps, in some way, they had both surpassed the darkness that King's Landing once embodied. Later that night, once the revelries waned, Sansa slipped away to the castle walls. The sky glimmered with scattered stars, and the city stretched below, alive with the distant hum of voices. She leaned against the parapet, reflecting on the final question that had haunted her. Could her time in King's Landing have taught her enough to surpass Littlefinger's schemes? She let the thought settle in her mind. She had undone Baelish. She had navigated court politics to ensure the North's security. She had witnessed the forging of a new system that might prevent a repeat of the endless wars. In a sense, yes, she had surpassed him, but her success was not merely cunning. It was shaped by loyalty, compassion, and an unbreakable resolve to protect her people. Traits Baelish never understood. She thought of the Red Keep as it once was, a place of gilded illusions. Now it was a battered fortress, hastily repaired, but perhaps more honest in its brokenness. And she, too, carried scars from her time here. But she would not let those scars define her. She was Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell, Guardian of the North, survivor of King's Landing, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a cautious sense of hope. A hush fell over the battlements. She heard distant laughter from the feast. The wind brushed her cheek with a cool caress. She could almost imagine her father standing behind her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, reminding her of the stark words, "Winter is coming." Yes, winter had come and passed, bringing horrors she could never forget. But she had emerged with the knowledge she needed to protect those she loved. King's Landing had been a crucible, and perhaps, just perhaps, something better could rise from its ashes. She closed her eyes, letting the breath of night fill her lungs. Tomorrow, she would see to the final details, ensure the North's place was written into law under King Bran's new system. Then she would set her course for Winterfell, returning home with the security she had fought so hard to gain. And as she thought of Winterfell's snow-covered towers, the memory of the Godswood's quiet stillness, she felt a faint tremor of relief. She had survived. She had grown. And she had won her home back in a world that might finally grant her family peace. So ended the endless day of negotiations, betrayals, and revelations. Beyond these walls, rumors would spread of a new monarchy, chosen by the lords, supported by an unlikely alliance, overseen by a Stark who was both boy and seer. People would whisper that Sansa Stark played a pivotal role, that she had learned the Game of Thrones so well she'd helped remake it. In hushed corners, They would say she had surpassed Peter Baelish himself, for she saw the realm not as a mere ladder for her own ascent, but as something to be safeguarded for all. And perhaps that would be the difference the realm needed. At length, she turned and walked along the battlements, each footstep measured, her cloak trailing behind. The flickering torches lit her path. A guard bowed as she passed, addressing her respectfully by her title. She acknowledged him with the briefest of nods, her mind drifting already to the roads that would lead her north. The city's illusions no longer ensnared her. She walked free, carrying with her the lessons that had shaped her into a force neither the Lannisters nor the Baelishes of the world could ever truly conquer. And high above, the stars kept their silent vigil, as though marking the dawn of a new era. One in which Sansa Stark's hard-earned wisdom would guide the North forward, and perhaps, in time, bring about the peace her father once dreamed of for them all.